Hello, happy Tuesday. Today is May 6th. Good to be back with you all. We are going to spend the next 3 days as exclusively as possibly on S-127 with a vote planned on Thursday, but would like to try to finish our work as best as possible today and tomorrow. We have a really extensive list of witnesses on both days. And so I'm going to ask folks when we have presenters for the most part to hold questions until the end and such things like that to make sure we're making time for everyone. Today, our goal is to, from our first 6 to 7 witnesses, is really to just understand the bill that's in front of us. And then we're going to hear testimony from different angles of the work from there. Anything anyone else wants to say?
Just a question, it's the 6th today, not the 5th.
Not sure. Oh, today's date. Did I say the 5th? Okay, it is the 6th, yes. Today's the 6th of May. Tomorrow's the 7th. We can all do numbers here. It's good. Okay. So with that, this bill has been to a number of committees. And so we are going to start by hearing from Representative Grading, the Vice Chair of the Committee of Commerce. And then we're going to hear from Representative Mahali. And then we'll hear from Legislative Council to walk through the bill. The bill is fairly extensive pieces related to housing, all of which I believe we've seen before in a different bill. And so most of our emphasis is going to be on the CHIP section, which is, I believe, what you're going to talk to us about. Thanks.
Yes. Hi, Edie Granning from Jericho, Vice Chair of Commerce and Economic Development Committee. There are roughly 23 pages of the bill that pertain to this community and housing infrastructure program that our committee took weeks of testimony on and came out with something that housing only changed a little bit. So there will be more too after they get to it. But what it is, it's a new program on tax increment financing districts to allow for infrastructure improvements for the purpose of housing. You don't need me to do, I'm not going to do a, that you have like.
Why you think this is all great and you sent it to us?
So everybody knows we're in a housing crisis in the state. Everybody knows we need more housing. And one of the big barriers, there are many, but one of the barriers is there isn't enough infrastructure to support the housing that we need. So what we were hoping to do is come up with some kind of a program that encourages affordable, moderate income housing through providing funds for infrastructure. So that's what this is intended to do. It's intended to make the program a little more streamlined. Again, money only for infrastructure with the purpose of building housing. And that complement was hard to make sure, right? How do you make sure that you're providing money only for one thing, but something else is going to be built with that infrastructure? And so we tried to really tie that together a little bit more than what came to us from the Senate.
Did you make any changes other than that you want us to understand your thinking of?
Probably, but I'm not, nothing is coming.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Thanks for being here with us. What was your vote out of committee?
It was unanimous.
Thanks. Thanks for joining us. Enjoy unemployment insurance law.
Letting me out. Happy to come back to it.
Yeah, Chair Mahali, thanks for joining us.
Is that time frame what you have in mind? 2 minutes?
Yeah, that's great. That'll work.
Mark Mahali, Callis, Chair of the House General on Housing. Most of the bill, what happened is the Senate, we sent a housing bill that I've talked to you about over to the Senate. The Senate sent us a housing bill. We've worked pretty closely with the chair of the Senate. So they're not that different. The bill, so after some discussion, the Senate bill, this one that you got, is the vehicle that we decided we use. Partly because here we are, we have possession of it, and really Commerce didn't have possession of the bill, but they worked on the language that came from the Senate for several weeks, really, and produced, I mean, I think it's really excellent work. So, and then also environment had some issues. We had some brownfields, how to make it faster, a few other brownfields things. That language came into our bill. So it's sort of all assembled in this 70-page behemoth that you've got. I'm just going to focus, in terms of the bill that's not CHIPS, I'll just focus on a few things that are a little different. The Senate bill came over with a provision that added citizenship and immigration status to as a protected class. And we worked with that, and it's included in the bill, in housing and public accommodations. There was a lot of question about what happens if someone doesn't have a social security number, and we took a lot of testimony from national landlords associations and found, frankly, somewhat to our surprise, that no, you don't need a social security number to do a background check or et cetera. I mean, I thought a lot of us thought we do, but you don't. Anyway, so that's in here. As you know, we put material in here to make it somewhat harder to appeal, to challenge a housing project. That's really the major. There really aren't that many changes from the housing bill that you saw before. In terms of CHIPS, maybe what I should focus on are what some people call the guardrails, the parts of CHIP. So there were several issues. One is, what's the geographic extent of CHIPS? How broadly in the state are we going to use public funding to fund housing? And the bill that came to us was focused on tier 1A and 1B for period. I mean, and associated growth areas. I don't want to get into the details, but basically tier 1. What we did, and actually I can tell you from my own village, tier 1B is pretty, and other, its associated areas, buffer areas, et cetera, pretty extensive. I mean, a lot of people have come to me saying, wait, what about my development? Turns out that they're in tier 1B, because tier 1B, I mean, all my little towns are in tier 1B. I'm not sure when they're going to build a lot of housing, but they're there. Nonetheless, we added one thing. We thought that when something that was in tier 2, simply because it didn't have the infrastructure that it needed, and the whole point of the project was to get them the infrastructure, that they should be in the project. So if something is tier, I guess I'll put it tier 1-able. If it could be a tier 1 and needs infrastructure, and the project is to give it infrastructure, it should be in. Then there was another section that came to us that said, in 2028, tier 2 is opened up. But what we understood from talking to members of the committee was it was really their intention to confront that issue in the next term after mapping was complete, and really look at tier 2 in light of the mapping that's being done under Act 250, under Act 181. And we thought that it would be good to try to anticipate some of that now and talk to the regional planning commissions. And right now, there's mapping going on for tier 2 that is focusing on what are called transition or infill areas. And so after consulting with the Environment Committee, we put in an tier 2 transitional areas that will be mapped by 2028 as transition or infill areas are eligible. And those are defined, it's a long definition, but basically existing or planned commercial, office, mixed use, or residential, either adjacent to a planned growth or village area, or a new standalone transition or infill area, and served by or planned for public water and wastewater. And it seemed to us like a good definition. So that's effective 2028.
Mark, can I ask you to step way back?
Yes.
And, we're going to spend time on this because it represents significant risks to the education fund. I'm not calling them costs, I'm calling them risks. And I'm curious why the development of housing infrastructure from your committee's perspective is a worthwhile risk to the education fund. I think that's the essential question
Okay.
we're going to be managing.
Got it. All right. So I will venture.
I'm sorry I didn't warn you about that question.
Yeah, okay, no. I will venture into this territory, which I have a feeling you've heard people talk about before. I actually believe in Vermont at this time that housing is a good thing for the grand list and for the education fund under CHIPS. And I'll explain that. I spent a lifetime in California. And in California, there is a real argument about whether or not you need to do tax increment financing for a development. The problem is a developer or a town has control over an area, and that's where they want to develop. So they say, I'd like to pour as much money into that as I can. So let's do tax increment. And nobody's asking the question, well, what if the same development would occur over here and doesn't need tax increment? Because they're all focused on this area. They own it or they own rights to it. And in an area like California, which is under enormous growth pressure, and there are so many developers, so much happening, I think the but-for inquiry is really worth making. I don't think that's Vermont right now. I think in Vermont, our problem is nothing is happening. Our problem in Vermont is the market is broken. It costs more to produce a house, a unit, than people can pay who are anywhere like ordinary middle class, or certainly for Vermonters. So I don't think there's a but-for problem here most of the time. If there's a parking lot with weeds in it that's producing 10 units, I'm just going to use units, 10 units of money for the ed fund, I think it's going to be producing 10 units of money 20 years from now for the ed fund. If we build, 4 fourplexes on that parking lot and it's suddenly producing 100 units of money, the question is, how does that advantage the ed fund? Now, here, Madam Chair, I think I need to get a little technical because it's worth it. One of the problems with normal tax increment financing, when you have a big area like downtown St. Albans or, big areas, is you always can make a case for more money. You issue bonds to begin with to build infrastructure. And then as the grand list grows, you issue more bonds. You just can issue bonds repeatedly. Under CHIPS, you can't do that. The way CHIPS work is you issue one bond for infrastructure at the start of the project, and the amount of the bond is based on your estimate of what that increment will be when that thing is built at that moment in time. If it's built and occupied 4 years out, that's the level that you can bond. But what happens in Vermont, as you know, is the grand list grows and it continues to grow.
Nice service.
It continues to grow. The grand list keeps growing. That growth, as soon as it happens, above and beyond the amount necessary for that original bond, goes to the ed fund. So I think in most situations, 6, 7, 8 years out, there's going to be more money coming to the ed fund than if that parking lot stayed a parking lot. So and in fact, what worries me is not but for, it's even with. Even with this, it's hard to make housing work in Vermont at this point, even without the tariffs. So does that answer the big picture? This is what I see now. I think CHIPS, by making it project specific and putting guardrails around where it's used and how it's used. The other area the other area that we worked on is low-income housing. Don't think poor people. Think almost all of the professions you can think of, short of doctors, lawyers, et cetera. When you look at the list of professions, I wish I brought it, that are 60% or 80% of annual median income, it's, construction workers and teachers and nurses and nursing assistants, and it just goes on and on. By the time you finish reading the list of professions, you think, isn't that everybody? Well, it's not everybody, but it's a lot. So there are advocates, and I think you will hear from them, who argue that we should only use this money, it's public money, we should only use it for low and moderate income housing, or for mixed use projects that are 20% low and moderate income housing. There are other people who argue, and I bet you'll hear from them, that, hey, this is financing, don't Christmas tree it, don't put a whole bunch of ornaments on it, just let it be money and don't try to accomplish the social purpose of affordable housing. I think that the CHIPS project that came out of the the committee had a rather elegant middle ground. And what we did is tighten it up somewhat. The middle ground they chose is very interesting. It's based on one section of the act. It's actually the purpose section. And the purpose section is, quote, and listen to this, it's important, provide revenues for improvements and related costs to encourage the development of primary residence for households of low or moderate income. Encourage the development of household, projects for households of low and moderate income. And then what the Commerce Committee did is put reference to that section throughout the bill so that it becomes kind of an operating section rather than a purpose section. So what do you need in order to apply? It has to be consistent with that purpose section. What does VEPC have to do? It has to approve projects if they're consistent with the purpose section. What we did is tighten it up just a little bit. We didn't go as far as many would have liked us to. We didn't simply require, you can only give the money to projects that are mixed use developments that are 20% of, low or moderate income housing. We didn't go that far, but we did define low income. We defined moderate income. And very importantly, we defined a project of low and moderate income housing as 20% affordable as inclusionary. And we just left that sitting there. Here's what we did not do. What could be done? We did not say VEPC has to give priority to the projects of low and moderate income housing, mixed use projects. We didn't say that. Their priority systems could be developed. We did not say you have a priority and you can only approve 3,000 housing units in 5 years or whatever under that. We didn't do that. But the architecture to do more is sitting there if one should want to. But that's where we went.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that you have laid out some architecture for us to build housing with and set up that delightful little metaphor for me. And if we have more questions about the committee's intent, we might ask you to come back in the next few days. But thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Representative
I
Udi.
just want to say that before this presentation.
Good job, Mark.
It's so clear.
If you think it's that clear, perhaps I omitted something.
You better-
Okay, we're gonna do one of those fun staff dance situations where Cameron Wood, if you could kick us off with the bill, taking us through a walkthrough. We're gonna go through most of Cam's sections fairly briefly, and then John's gonna jump in and we're gonna go in much greater depth on the section he worked on. Thank you. And folks, for camp sections, let's try to hold questions till the ends of larger sections. Because we've already actually voted out the bulk of that's in here, and I don't want us to relitigate things we already made decisions about. It's because we don't remember making those decisions.
All right. For the record, Cameron Wood, Office of Legislative Counsel. I am going to do my best to be extremely succinct in walking you through most of what is in this proposal of amendment to S 127. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. As I mentioned, this is the Senate Housing Bill, came over to the House, went to House General, has been worked on by multiple committees. House General has compiled this proposal of amendment that you all are looking at here. So essentially, what House General has done, you all passed your housing bill earlier this session. That's in Senate Economic Development currently. The Senate passed their housing bill. There wasn't a lot that was in conflict. There were a few things that were slightly different. And so what this proposal of amendment has done is really combine those two things together. So I'm going to try to just kind of briefly pass over and comment on things that you all have already reviewed and just mention kind of the big highlights of things that are new, or what was not in your housing bill that stopped in this committee earlier this session. Section 1, changes to VHIP, the Vermont Rental Housing Improvement Program. This is relatively the same as it came out in H 479. There is one slight difference. And I'll pause there and I'll say, if you all recall, the big change here in VHIP among all these kind of smaller amendments here is for the 10-year program. So you have the grants in the 5-year or the 10-year. It's going back to what it was previously, to a change that was implemented last year, and it allows landlords to rent those units for fair market rent. So the grants in the 5 years have to be rented to individuals who meet certain population description, homelessness, refugee resettlement, etc. The 10-year, a change was made last year to enact the same provisions. This is reverting it back to allowing for 10 years to rent those units for fair market rent. That's the biggest change, really, I'd say, in this section. However, under the 5-year and the grant programs, the proposal here from the Senate and the House General has included it in this proposal of amendment is to add individuals who are displaced due to a natural disaster. So not only individuals who are homeless, refugee resettlement, et cetera, adding displaced due to natural disaster.
What page are you on?
Apologies, that was on page 3.
Sorry, thank you.
Yes, sir. And I'm going to keep moving quickly to try to keep you guys on track. So I know you have a very long list. So please stop me if you need to. One other quick amendment that was done here is there was, this is page 5, lines 3 and 4. This was language that was kind of inadvertently struck in the House bill and the Senate bill. And I pointed it out and spoke with the administration about not striking it. It requires a landlord to accept any housing vouchers. That's not language that you want to strike, and it was just kind of inadvertent. So I'm just highlighting for you all that it's being unstruck. Okay, this is the minimum set aside. This is the same language that was in the House. It sets aside 30% of the funds annually for the 5-year and the grants. So all this is that was in H 479 remains in this bill, along with the reporting requirements. So I'm just going to keep us moving. Section 2 is the Manufactured Home Improvement Repair Program. This is taking a program that currently exists in session law, putting it in statute. These are funds that provide funding to manufactured home communities to help, repair lots and get them ready to be rented out to manufactured homes. It can provide money directly to manufactured homeowners to help address habitability issues in their homes, et cetera. No changes to this section. So I'm going to keep us going. Page 9. Section 3, Vermont Infrastructure Sustainability Fund. If you all recall from the last time we walked through, this is with the Vermont Bond Bank, providing them with funds that they can use to provide low interest loans or purchase bonds from municipalities for development of water, wastewater infrastructure, et cetera. The only real change among some minor language tweaks for clarity, the only real significant change to what you all agreed to in H 479 is going to be on page 12. And this is H2. The bond bank asked it for some language that will allow them to kind of use the funds in the infrastructure sustainability fund, because it's not a lot of money. So they wanted to make sure that they had the ability to do things like interfund transfers, et cetera, to really package those dollars with the other programs that we have to make sure they could kind of leverage them to the best of their ability. So I drafted this and they approved it. The bank may use the funds in conjunction with other bank programs to accomplish the policy objectives outlined in the section. Okay, so section 4, this is new to that.
Before we move on, I sort of want to flag for folks that it seems to me that the goals of the bond bank infrastructure program are remarkably similar to the goals of CHIP. And so it creates an interesting opportunity to be thinking about sort of what mechanism is best used for what housing infrastructure. Very different mechanisms.
I would agree with you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much.
Okay, section 4 is, this was not in your housing bill. However, this was in the Budget Adjustment Act. This is VHFA's rental housing revolving loan program. So a program that they operate, it's a revolving loan where they can help build housing, and the landlords under that program are required to keep increases in rent for subsidized units shall not exceed 3%. Because of current times, VHFA was asking that there be some slight ability for them to increase that. So it is language or an amount otherwise authorized by the agency. Again, this was in your Budget Adjustment Act. It's just been brought over here. Okay, section 5, Universal Design Study Committee. You all recall this was in your housing bill. It is creating a study committee to look at implementation of statewide universal design standards for residential buildings.
Great, thank you.
Okay, moving on. They are adding, or there's a proposal to add a committee that was in the Senate version, which is to look at developing a state plan, or I should say, generating a state plan to develop housing for individuals with developmental disabilities. So it was a committee that was in the Senate version, wasn't discussed in the House. They've simply brought it over. Both of these committees have language saying that the reimbursement for per diems is only there in the event that it's budgeted. Tax Department Housing Data Access. This is the CAMA. The next section, section 8. I'm on all the way to page 22 now. The next 2 sections are the landlord certificate that you all discussed in your housing bill. So this hasn't changed, repealing what was done last year, inserting slightly amended language in the landlord certificate moving forward. Moving on, section 10, I'm all the way at the bottom of page 23, top of 24. Land bank report. This was in the housing bill. It's the same, requiring information from the administration on how to create a statewide land bank. Okay. Housing and public accommodations protections. The next few sections were not in the House housing bill. A version of them were in the Senate housing bill. Chair Mahali briefly spoke to this. This first section here relates to landlords being asked for information from prospective tenants on when they want to conduct a background check or a credit check. And it says the landlord shall accept a copy of one of the following: Social Security number, an individual taxpayer identification number, or an original copy of an unexpired government identification. And then the next few sections are adding citizenship and immigration status into public housing, public accommodations, and then the unfair housing practices section. There is some language in the Unfair Housing Act. And this is going to be on page 30. Starting on lines 4, there are 2 subsections here, D and E, that the committee put in specifically to address potential issues or conflicts with federal law. So D says that if it's required, verification of immigration status or differential treatment on the basis of citizenship shall not constitute a violation. There was concern if federal law is changed to require individuals to verify immigration status when renting units. So that section was added. And then subsection E is when issuing mortgages or issuing lending, it's not unlawful discrimination for the lender to consider a credit applicant's immigration status to the extent such status has a bearing on the lender's rights and remedies regarding repayment. The concern is people will be issuing loans and federal law authorizes them to take immigration status into consideration when determining the risks associated with issuing those loans. And so they wanted similar language in state law to allow them to do the same. Okay, housing appeals, this is not my area of expertise. What I can assure you is all of these sections are the same as was in your original House bill. So
That's very rich.
I'm not going to pause on them and I'm just going to keep going. That's good.
And that's, folks, that's also not John's section. It's Ellen's section. So if folks do want to take more testimony on that or learn more about it, either please find Ellen or let me know and I can try to schedule her in.
Okay, we're on page 37. We're moving into brownfields. This is not my section either. This is Michael O'Grady's section. I will comment that it includes the language that you all passed in H 479 and then includes 2 sections that were in the Senate Housing Bill related to management of development soils. And essentially this allows development soils to be managed at a location pursuant to an insignificant waste event authorized by A&R, as long as they're managed properly. I'll leave it at that. If you have specific detailed questions, I'd refer you to Michael O'Grady, but these are 2 sections that were in the Senate bill that the House is simply adding into your housing bill to what was already there. And if you all recall, your changes were simply to have them prioritize brownfields that are going to have housing on them. That was in your bill. Okay. I'm going to keep going. So I've already moved on to page 41. This is where I'm going to pause because this is where you're going to get John shortly to discuss the tax increment financing.
Do you want to skip this section and just finish?
That's exactly,
Okay.
that was my plan, Madam Chair, because I'm going all the way to page 66. These are the last few sections. These next 2 were not included in your housing bill. These were included on the Senate side, and the House General Committee just wanted to incorporate them in. These are some more technical amendments to chapters related to smoke and carbon monoxide detectors. This is not my area. This would be Damian Leonard if you have specific questions, but essentially what this entire thing is doing is changing the word detector to alarm. And then it is adding, so they have to install photoelectric only type, and it's allowing for photoelectric type or UL 217 compliant detectors. I have no idea what UL 217 compliant detectors are. I can tell you that this was a proposal from the Division of Fire Safety and the administration, and it's more technical. If you have questions.
And I'll ask if anyone wants to learn more about that, please do that outside of the room and then come back and report to us.
Okay. Last thing, there was the VHFA offsite construction report. It was in your housing bill. It had $250,000 attached to it. That was removed in the budget process. And so this section is simply asking that VHFA still do that report without requiring them to do it. Since you're not attaching any money to it, they still wanted to include it as kind of a showing them their intention that they still conduct the report. So it says, provided there are sufficient resources, VHFA shall issue this report. VHFA has testified that they are hoping to still do the report, given their capacities. And that's it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any questions for Kim?
So basically, nothing to see here.
Nothing to see here. Focus on tax increment finance. Give John a hard time. I'll keep the easy stuff.
I'm hopeful that at some point here this afternoon, someone will talk to us about the difference between a TIF and CHIP.
Great. I think we can guarantee that will happen. Also tomorrow, both days.
Happy to come back. Happy to answer any questions you have offline.
Thank you.
I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.
You do too.
I'm not gonna hang around this blazing hot room.
Yeah. It's actually just gonna, yes.
Their duties are.
I can sit and someone else can do that. Thank you.
You want me to jump in?
If you don't mind.
Well, that's okay.
Can you guys do that one? Thank you. If you won't be too cold.
Yes, I can already.
Hello, John.
Hello. Hello.
Hi, John.
John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. Shall I just write in?
Please do.
Okay. Me,
Or if you want to start with a big picture, what is a chip and what is a tip?
can do that. I can try to answer that question. So the easiest way to think about, first, they're both tax increment financing. So don't let the acronym CHIP make you think that it is not financing. It is. The difference is in the scope and the targets. So a TIP district is a broad geographic area that's being created within which a bunch of different projects might be pursued. And you may not know at the outset of the district the kinds of projects that are going to be pursued in your district. In both cases, you're funding infrastructure with the idea of stimulating particular kinds of development. The specific target of the CHIP program is that the development create housing. It can create other things too, but it needs to have a certain amount of housing to get in the door. But in both cases, you're using tax increment generated from increased property values to fund infrastructural improvements to pursue particular kind of development. TIP districts, broad geographic area, you might have a bunch of different projects and you might not know at the outset what those are going to be that you're going to be financing. For CHIP, it's a project-based approach to tax increment financing, meaning that you're going in the door with a specific target. And so you have a small geographic area as opposed to a broad district. You're saying on this site, we're going to have housing development, and that housing development will be tied to the specific infrastructural improvements that you're funding through CHIP. That is the simple way to explain them. There's technical differences between the two in terms of the amount of increment available, the kinds of behavior they try to incentivize, the different hoops you have to jump through to get in the door. You know, one of the complaints that's often made against TIP is that it's not available to smaller municipalities. So there is an effort to slim down some of the restrictions to get in the door for the CHIP program. But at the highest level, it's the difference between a district and a project-based approach to tax increment financing. Districts have broader purposes for the kinds of development that might be pursued, and CHIP is about trying to create housing, but just know you can have mixed use and other kinds of development. That's the high level explanation of the difference.
Great, thanks. And we will learn a lot more right now.
Let's hope so. Okay, so Cameron skipped over my sections. So we are back on page 41.
And please go significantly slower.
Yes, I did not intend to be nearly as efficient as he was. And maybe it's just a kind of orientation. I know that I've walked through some of the concepts in this bill before. It's probably been, I can't keep track of time, but it's been some time since I've done that. I can call out as we go through places where House Commerce or House General made changes as against what you received from the Senate. And just high level, I can tell you the 10 changes basically that you're going to see, if that is helpful. But it also just may be way too much information.
I think that would be too much information. I think it would just be good to get our heads around what's here in front of us.
Okay. So we'll start with the definition section. I will try not to hit pieces that should be familiar from TIP districts, but please tell me if you would like to.
I think we still would.
Yeah. Okay. So for TIP.
Folks, let's do questions at the end of each section if that's works for people.
So in that case, I'll just try to do line by line then. I will try to explain the concept rather than reading out the language. Brownfields, hopefully this is familiar to you. This is something that we use in TIP districts. We allow for brownfield remediation as one of the infrastructural kinds of improvements that you can pursue through the program. This is just creating a definition to capture what a brownfield is. So brownfield remediation would also be a pursuable kind of infrastructure in this program. So just know that the reason this is being included here is to get at the category improvements. And when we get to the definition of improvements, we can probably talk more substantively there about the things that are covered. you will recall Representative Branning stating that the financing is for infrastructure, and I'm going to repeat that a million times as I go through this. The financing is not for the housing development that is being stimulated. It is just for the infrastructure improvements. And so the definition of improvements is the category of things that you can finance through this program. Just that's why that word is so important. And I will just say it a million times. Committed, this is just a technical term to try to get at if you have put increment toward financing and related costs. Truly just a technical term. It's something that we use in TIF districts, not novel to this approach. Developer, hopefully intuitive concept. This is the person undertaking to construct a housing development. The reason we need a defined term for this is to be able to call them out as a signatory to the housing infrastructure agreement, which we will come to. But basically, unlike for TIF districts, where it is the municipality who undertakes any of the financing for the infrastructure, because the CHIP program contemplates that other kinds of sponsors could be behind the financing for the infrastructure improvements. So you could have the municipality, but you could also have the developer, or you could have a third-party agency, potentially. Because you have those parties involved in the CHIP program, you need to have a defined term to call out that party as a signatory to this housing infrastructure agreement, which is one of the ways to apply safeguards to the process that's being created here. Again, we're just in the definition section, so this is going to be annoying, just kind of soaking in information, and hopefully it will make more sense as we get to the actual substantive provisions. Financing, this is the debt. This is the debt, including principal, interest, and fees, incurred by a sponsor or other instruments or borrowing used by a sponsor to pay for that project, the housing infrastructure project. And if it was authorized by the municipality, that requires a public vote. But this is what you are applying the increment to, the debt that you're taking out, or whatever the financing might be. Definitions 5 and 6 came from House General. These were parts of what Representative Mahaly flagged as the inclusion of an affordability construct. So I will talk about these more when we get to the actual construct itself.
Are those same ideas defined other places in statute?
We have alternative ways to get at this kind of piece. So for instance, in Title 24, we have a definition of affordable housing that speaks to owner occupied being at 120%, no more than 30% of 120% AMI. And we have a similar provision for renters where we say no more than 30% of the income of a household at 80% of AMI. So we do have constructs like this and that similarly use an area median income type category. So there is something similar in existing law, but the difference here is that this is agnostic. This doesn't differentiate between owners and renters. And additionally, when we get to the actual construct, I'll explain one of the strange effects that having both of these available causes.
I broke my own rule, so we're gonna wait until the end. I'm sorry, Jim. I will now follow my own rule. I'm sorry. Setting bad precedent. Back to you, Sharon.
Housing development. Again, this is meant to be an intuitive concept. We just want to be able to call out what the thing on the plot, the housing development site, is, so that we can subject it to the strictures of this program. So if you want to have project criteria that restrain what can be done here, we need to be able to reference the thing to which those project criteria apply, and that's the housing development. Construction rehabilitation, this is key. Note that as this came across from the Senate, it was just construction of a building or buildings on the housing development site. And now we have construction, rehab, or renovation of any building on a housing development site approved under the subchapter. And so this would pick up ways that you're creating could be an uninhabitable structure, turning it into a habitable structure, increasing housing in that way. So substantive expansion here from what you receive from the House. Housing development site, and we're on page 43. This is the parcel or parcels encompassing a housing development that are authorized by the municipality. Just to call out, if you want the real heart of what this means, look to section 1908. And I will just explain it here too. The way that it works is wherever you're constructing or rehabilitating your housing development, that parcel will be part of your housing development site. And then immediately adjoining parcels would be part of it too. So basically think of it as like a circle around where you are building. All of that would be part of your housing development site. And to orient you, the reason that the housing development site matters, you can think of this as the analog to the district. TIP districts have districts, broad geographic area. CHIP has housing development site. It's where the housing development occurs. This is where your OTV, your original taxable value, is set. This is where you determine the increment generated. It's where you're trying to increase property values attributable to the development. And note too, there can be geographic separation between the housing development site and where you install the infrastructure that you're financing. So they could be the same, but they don't have to be. Imagine, for instance, that you have a parking lot that is specific to a housing development that would be built down the road, for instance, or you're installing water or sewage and it's broadly available to the area, but you're also setting up your housing development site for a particular development. So they don't have to be in the same place. But know that the housing development site is the analog to a district. It is where OTV matters and where the increment is generated. Housing infrastructure agreement, we've talked a little bit about this, and we'll come to a section that is specifically dedicated to this. This is just the binding agreement among the parties under CHIP. So it'd be the municipality, the developer.
The TIF district, oh God, I'm supposed to wait. Following my rules. Continue on, Bill.
This is so exciting for me to get to talk without stopping me. The agreement would be between the muni, the developer, and if they happen to have a sponsor that is neither the municipality nor the developer, they would include that party part of this. And the agreement, as we'll see when we come to the particular section, governs some of the key restrictions that are built in here, like primary residence, and ensuring that you have safeguards for the municipality. Housing infrastructure project. This is the improvements. This is what we call out as the improvements. This is what the municipality is going forward to finance. Improvements, I called this out as a substantively important term earlier. This is your infrastructure. There's a technical provision as well, which I'll talk about. But in A, you can think of this as your bucket of infrastructure that can be financed. So installation, construction, and importantly, rehabilitation that was added on the health side of infrastructure that will serve a public good and fulfill the purpose of this subchapter, including, and then it has a long list of inclusive items. I did want to talk about the public good piece. For TIP districts, we have a definition of improvements that is quite similar to what you see here with a few modifications. And one of the ways it's different is it says that will serve a public purpose. And the constraint that folks have taken this to mean is that infrastructure funded through TIFs would need to be publicly owned. Part of why you see a shift here to public good is that basically people are thinking of the good that the program is providing is housing. And so it's being agnostic as to who owns that infrastructure. And if you think again about the example of something like a parking lot being constructed to incentivize the development of a housing development, you might think that parking lot would be owned by someone other than the municipality. It's not to say that everything would be private. It's just, this is why the Senate, which is where this public good language came from. This is why the Senate wanted to have a shift here from public purpose to public good. You heard Chair Mahali talk about the purpose earlier. So just note that there's this dual piece, serve a public good, and it has to fulfill the purpose of the subchapter. How substantive and restrictive that effect will probably ultimately come down to BEPC's analysis of how that works. And then just know that an inclusive list of items, utilities, digital infrastructure, roads, bridges, sidewalks, parking, et cetera, is just an inclusive list. This is not an exhaustive list of things that could be considered infrastructure. And this matches almost exactly with one stylistic tweak, what you receive from the House, which again mirrors what TIF districts do. I mentioned a technical provision that's part of the definition of improvements, and that's this division B, the funding of debt service interest payments for a period of up to 4 years. This is, if you'll recall, financing, and the increment is applied against financing or improvements. So what this is saying, why there is a technical provision here related to debt service interest payments, is it's saying you can take on financing to cover the funding of debt service interest payments for a period of up to 4 years, beginning on the date on which the debt is first incurred. Conceptually, the reason that this matters is you can imagine that in the early years of a project or district, you may have insufficient increment generated because the property values simply haven't risen enough yet to cover the cost of your financing. And so you need to build into your financing how you're going to actually account for debt service interest payments in those early years. That's what this is trying to get at. This is something that TIP districts do. They have this provision, but note that their period is shorter. For TIP districts, the funding of debt service interest payments for a period of up to 2 years, not 4 years. And the thinking behind why 4 years was offered in this context was, I think, that because the geographic site is likely to be smaller, it was thought that the increments generated may be smaller proportionally to what you relative to what you receive for a district. And so you might need more upfront financing built into. And you can think of it as you're taking out financing to cover your early financing costs. That's what this is. And just know the difference is the time period here. 4 years. Legislative body, mayor, alder board, city council, select board, president, trustees, they have significant discretion to create the areas to pursue negotiations with the developer. This is a really important party. And note that one of the differences between TIP districts and CHIP is that while both employ the concept of legislative body, recall that for TIP, if you're taking on a bond, because only the municipality can finance the project, that means that any instance will be a public vote of debt being taken on by the municipality. In this case, you have an alternative route to route your financing. And so if the developer is the one doing the financing for a program, you would not have to have a public vote for that financing that's taken on by the developer. And so I just point that out here in regards to the legislative body piece, because it means that the legislative body, you could see them as having somewhat less checks on what's happening, but we'll come to the substantive checks in the program itself. 13 and 14, these are again lower moderate. This is part of the affordability construct that Representative Mohali was speaking to. So lower moderate income housing. This is housing for which the total annual cost of renting or ownership does not exceed 30% of gross annual income of a household of low income or household of moderate income. The piece I wanted to call out about the odd consequence produced by having two categories, housing of low income and housing of moderate income, is that if you're checking against both thresholds to get in the door, a project that would satisfy a household of moderate income, a project that would satisfy a household of low income would necessarily satisfy the condition for a household of moderate income, right? If it's affordable to someone at a lower rate, it would be affordable to someone who could afford a higher rate. So just want to call that out, that having these both available creates really the threshold is it affordable to someone of moderate income if you have a higher threshold available under the program. Lower moderate income housing development. This is the way that you pull in how much of your housing has to be subject to affordability constraints. So housing development of which at least 20% of the units are low or moderate income housing units. And you'll see the call out to covenants here. Lower moderate income housing units shall be subject to covenant restrictions that preserve their affordability till all indebtedness has been retired. So we'll come to the affordability construct, but just to foreshadow here, this is a time-limited affordability. The covenants that would be built in, they would basically match up to the length of your financing. And at the expiration of your financing, you would no longer have to have those affordability covenants in place. And again, just to remind what the chair was talking about earlier, we do have a construct in 24 related to affordable housing that builds in a definition of affordable housing development, uses a similar 20% threshold. Municipality, city, town, or incorporated village, original taxable value. This is the total valuation of the housing development site as of the creation date. So this is the point from which you are determining the increment generated. You set an original taxable value, and then each year thereafter, you assess the value and you determine how much it is changed by. The tax on that proportion, that change, is what is your tax increment. So original taxable values. Original taxable value matters, and it's important to recall that it is set as of the creation date. As we'll come to later, the creation date that is set for CHIP is different than the creation date that is set for TIP districts. For TIP districts, the creation date is April 1 of the year in which the municipality actually creates the geographic area, the district. The creation date for a CHIP for this a project under the CHIP subchapter would be the date April 1 of the year in which VEPC approves tax increment financing for that project. So that would be sometime in the future after the geographic area has been set. And I can explain more why folks might want that later. Related cost, I've been talking about how you're applying increment against financing for the improvements, but another piece that can be covered is related costs. Same provisions we use for TIF districts. These are expenses incurred and paid by the municipality exclusive of the actual cost of that construction and financing that are related to implementing the project. So if the municipality has to have departmental or personnel costs, this is where you build in those pieces. Sponsor, this is kind of one of the core concepts of the CHIP program. We've been talking about this up to this point. This is the person undertaking to finance a housing infrastructure project. The huge difference as against TIF districts is that for TIF districts, only the municipality can bond, and only that bond is what's coverable by tax increment financing. Here, any of a municipality, a developer, or an independent agency that meets state lending standards may serve as a sponsor for a housing infrastructure project. So 3 parties possible. You can think of this also as the financier, if that's a more intuitive concept for you. The purpose section. Yes.
Definitions question.
Yeah, so question on brownfield, your definition there, it also appears elsewhere in statute. So I'm just wondering how that squares.
I think we do have like a inline definition for brownfield in Title 32 for TIF districts. When I put this together, I took from what we do have available in Title 32 and then spoke with Mike O'Grady about how this aligns with federal law. And this is the closest alignment to federal law that we could do that aligns with the way that we describe it in Title 32. But this is the definition, and it's important. All of these definitions are just for this subchapter. I know that is obvious to everyone, but just helpful to reorient. These are technical definitions to describe what will happen under the CHIP program. This is meant to be consistent with what we do for TIF districts. It just has some, I'm trying to think of, I think I use hazardous material, pollutant, or contaminant, which just in talking with my attorney was the best way to align with federal law.
Similar, the legislative body definition, is that line up with?
Yes, I didn't create anything new here for the.
Representative Maslin, you had a definition question?
Yeah, earlier we talked about definition of affordable housing, the low income, moderate income. You said similar descriptions, definitions exist probably in other parts of statute, I think. Are they completely compatible? Is someone going to get confused on what it says here or someone says there?
So I can't speak to whether people will be confused. They often are. So I would just say you're creating technical definitions for a subchapter that are exclusive to that subchapter. The extent to which I think you avoid some of that risk is that this is truly a different term. So it's low to moderate versus affordable. So there is a different term that is spelled out. If it is helpful to see the definition of affordable housing that exists in Title 24, I can show you that.
I'll take your word for it, sir. This makes good sense.
I think it's an important issue that we should probably straighten out before I leave here. Housing development site, under TIFs, do all the things need to touch each other? I can't find the right word.
Thank you.
Thank you. I knew it was a ceiling.
I think that they are, but I feel uncomfortable saying that definitively. The process is that the muni at the outset creates a map and defines an area. I'm not familiar with one that
Okay.
I would need more information, I think.
I got an exception to be not contiguous.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you send it out?
Burlington's not contiguous, but we think they got an exception to not be contiguous, but can you just look into that for us? Thank you. Was there a definition question over here? Representative Odie.
I'm not sure it's the definitions, it might be, and before,
Oh, we've talked about so far, so.
is there a definition? Or, is there any, I didn't see any quality definitions here, but did you hear that there's quality in construction in the project?
There's nothing like that.
No quality.
There's no like building code types, if that's what you're referencing.
Yeah.
Yep.
Trying to.
So, and the improvements, public use versus public good.
Yes.
So am I interpreting it correct that public use in the TIF statute, then that means that it is always open to public use. Unrestricted and public good could mean it has a public benefit, but not always open to unrestricted public use.
That is at least the way that Senate Economic Development was reasoning when they proposed this change. I think that's probably a question for how Betsy interprets these terms. I will admit that when I was asked to include it, it was not so obvious to me that it would produce that effect. I think of those as quite similar, but I get the argument. I think if you want to be clear as to whether private ownership is useful, is permissible, you could just outright say that, right? You could just be clear that the installation, construction, and rehabilitation of infrastructure will serve a public good, but may be owned publicly or privately. Like, you could be clearer on that front if that is the intent.
And then I guess the second question, in the public recreation, has there been discussion of what that is? I mean, I've heard swing sets, but I would like to get a little better idea of how that's defined.
I hear playgrounds, I hear trails is something that I've heard, and I think that the public recreation language,
It's okay.
there was language like this in the Spark concept that came across at the start of the session. So I want to say that this is where that originated, but
There's no real definition.
there's no real definition. And again, I would just remind anyone when we start talking about the list, it really is an indicative list. This is not exhaustive as to what you can do here. However, the more and more you add to this, the more exhaustive you seem to suggest that it is, because why create a laundry list of items if it's truly meant to be indicative? And I will just note that when we were in House Commerce, they went back and forth on how they approached improvements. And at one point, they had talked about a definition that did not create a broad category called infrastructure and then provided an indicative list. They just spelled out exactly the things that could be coverable. So roads, sewer, they called out specific things that you could pursue. And if you didn't fall into those categories, you would not be financed by the program. So there's different ways to do it. There's some that's much narrower than this approach. And there's an alternative construct to try to create an in-between bucket, which was something like the minimum infrastructure required to create habitability at the housing development site. So trying to get at the infrastructure that would be required to achieve that, but leaves a lot in the hands of folks administering the program.
I'm wondering if the municipalities will get involved with what type of recreational. Or
Yeah, I mean, in any event, they're heavily involved in the process to put this forward. And again, just to think about the housing development, which is presumably what the developer is most invested in, it can be distinct from the infrastructure itself. So the Muni is pursuing the infrastructure, and they're going to be putting forward a plan that describes all of these pieces. So I would expect,
Okay, oh, yeah. Number 14, the lower moderate income housing development.
yes.
I understand the 20% is there to define the quantity, but I'm not. Can you explain the next sentence, in which it says, you can have covenants until the indebtedness is totally retired? What happens after the indebtedness is retired?
At that point, the covenants, you could have, it would be ultimately up to folks, but the requirement would be that this is building in a requirement for accessing an incentive structure later in the bill. So the way that this works is if you can meet this affordability criterion, which is not a requirement to get through CHIP, you can have a project that doesn't embrace affordability constraints. But if you do pursue an affordable project that meets these particular standards, you have available to you an increased increment retention. So there's a dual structure. Normal projects that don't meet the affordability would have 70% education property tax increment available to them. And if you had the affordability piece, you would have 80% available. So what this really does is it creates a restriction that you have to meet to access that additional 10% increment. And what it's saying is the restriction you have to meet is affordability covenants till the end of the financing. It's not to say that you couldn't create a perpetually affordable housing development, right? It's just saying to achieve this, you only have to do it for the duration of the financing. And so that would be the terms of your bonding or the like, which might be 30 years or, something to that effect. So it would be dependent on what the terms of the financing for the project are that would determine the extent of affordability, the duration of affordability being required.
Okay, and that's described later on in the bill in terms of this extra retention period.
Exactly.
That's where this pulls in.
Yep. Yeah, going through the definitions, it's like you're getting all the information without any of the context.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll read it then.
Okay, let's get into it.
Section 1907, I'm on page 45. We are talking about the purpose section, and I believe that Representative Mahali read this out to you, but I'll just call this out again. This is brought in a number of places, and both committees, both House Commerce and House General, incorporated the purpose section in ways throughout the chapter that is beyond what the Senate had provided to you and requires some determinations by the municipality and VEPSI the purpose is being met. So I would say they fleshed out the extent to which the purpose is constraining the program. When you received this from the Senate, they had a purpose section, but the extent to which it flowed into the bill beyond being a standalone purpose section was in that definition of improvements that we just talked about. And I'll come, when we get to the places where the purpose is brought in, I'll call that out. But the purpose to provide revenues for improvements and related costs to encourage the development of primary residences for households of low or moderate income. That's the whole of that section. I will go on, unless folks have questions about the purpose. Section 1908, this is the start of the process for a municipality that is trying to pursue a housing infrastructure project under this program. So how does a municipality create the project and the development site? Again, the development site is the geographic area from which you're setting your OTB. It is the analog to a district. So subsection A, the legislative body of a municipality may create within its jurisdiction a housing infrastructure project, which consists of those improvements that stimulate the development of housing, and a housing development site shall consist of the parcel or parcels on which a housing development is installed or constructed, and any immediately contiguous parcels. So that was that definition I was talking about earlier. This is where it's fleshed out for housing development site. It's the parcel on which construction for the housing development is occurring, and any immediately contiguous parcels. To create that project and housing development site, a municipality in coordination with stakeholders, so note that they can avail themselves of the aid of the developer and the like, who's going to have a stake in moving this forward. This is in part this is proposed in Senate Economic Development to try to get at try to ease some of the burdens for smaller communities. A municipality in coordination with stakeholders shall develop a housing development plan, which would include a description of the infrastructure, the proposed housing development, and the proposed housing development site. So infrastructure, housing development, and where that housing development is occurring. Could identify the sponsor who's financing the infrastructure. You would set out a tax increment financing plan, and we'll come to the standards for that. A pro forma projection of expected cost, projection of the, tax increment to be generated by that proposed housing development. So how much are property values expected to rise, and how much tax increment would be generated from that rise in property value. A development schedule with a list, cost estimate, and schedule for the infrastructure project and housing development. And this last line was added by House Commerce, a determination that the proposed housing development furthers the purposes of section 1907 of the subchapter. So broadly, think about this. Muni's creating a housing development plan. It describes what you're doing.
What is section 1907?
The purpose section.
Oh, okay, thank you.
The purpose section. Sorry. You create a housing development plan that describes the infrastructure, it describes the housing development, it describes the site, gives you a timeline, it sets up the financing. And then one of the things that it tells you is that the municipality has made a determination that that proposed housing development furthers the purposes of the subchapter. So they have to actually look at what they're receiving, what kind of project they're looking at, and ask themselves, does this help stimulate the development of primary residences for households of low to moderate income? Additionally, so that's the housing development plan. The community also has to develop a plan describing that housing development site. Just think of this as a map. They're creating a map that tells you the area where you're setting the OTB. They have to hold one or more public hearings after public notice on the proposed housing infrastructure project, including the plan. So both the housing development plan, which contains all those things we just discussed, and the map. And then they adopt by act of the legislative body of the municipality the plan developed, that map, which would be recorded with the municipal clerk and lister or assessor. And I called out in the definition section some of the raised importance of the legislative body here, because I just want to call out instances in which you can see it's the legislative body pursuing a particular action. And then you'll often see accompanying those different ways of applying pressure that's meant to get at public good. So in this instance, you see in subdivision 3, holding public hearings, right? It's the legislative body that's creating this map, creating the plan and putting it forward, but there would be public hearings held on that. Under subsection C, the creation of the housing development site shall occur at 12:01 a.m. on April 1 of the calendar year in which BEPC approves tax increment financing. I talked earlier about how the creation really matters. And that for TIF districts, the creation occurs April 1 of the year in which the muni votes to create that map, right? And here it's when BEPC approves tax increment financing. And that affects things like your debt incursion clock, which we'll come to, and when your retention periods are. So creation matters, and having this tied to BEPC approval is a substantive change from having it be when municipalities approve the actual geographic area. And that is the process by which a muni sets out its plan and creates a geographic area from which the OTV would be set. But just note that if you're a muni and all you have done is gone through this section, nothing has happened. You've just created a plan and a map, but no approval of tax increment financing has happened yet. This is just, you're creating the framework so that when you go to BEPC, you have something in hand. Do folks have questions about that section?
Questions?
Is it yours about the time?
What?
Is yours about the time? That's a silly question I have.
No, that's always how the grand list is set. But no, my question was more just by recording it, that doesn't really do anything. Doesn't create a lien on the property. It's just a matter of record that somebody's interested in doing it. Is that correct?
Yeah. This is just having something you can point to determine the OTV. That's what this is. And it does point to one of the oddities of creating of switching to BEPC approval for starting the clock, right? If you think of it as being the year in which the municipality actually creates it, there's a tie, right? Municipality created the geographic area and then it's recorded, and we do it on April 1 to align with dates for which we set property values and the like. You do get this kind of odd conceptual disjunction when you make it when BEPC approves, which could be a year after the municipality has created it. But all you're doing when you're recording this is just saying, we have a plan called Proposed Housing Development Site, municipal name, Vermont. That's all that it's doing.
I'm wondering if the OTV would be more likely to be higher once
Yes.
the plan, and then that would be helpful here.
So there is a way of, there's interest on both sides. What you're describing makes sense to me just intuitively, which is that the later you set your OTV, and that's what we're saying here, is that your OTV theoretically, if BEPC approval doesn't arrive in the same year in which the municipality creates this, theoretically, this creation date would be in the future. So your OTV would be set later, which would mean if we assume property growth, that the OTV is set at a higher value, and you could think of that as more protective of the ed fund. We'll come to some other pieces later because there's competing interests related to the retention periods and the like.
It would also be not only later and so greater value, but once it's known that there will be development there, it makes it a more valuable piece of land.
And I think that's an interesting question too. Yeah, how much does that affect the property values once it's known? Yeah.
You need to have appraisals in order for that to happen.
And it is one thing to note. I want to say the way that it works for TIF districts is that you're having an assessment at the start, but then throughout the period, I don't know that folks are going yearly to assess. There's no provision to change that piece here. And if you were interested in having like an actual assessment each year, we would need to do something on that.
Right, 1909.
1909, Housing Infrastructure Agreement. This is the agreement that's governing the relationship between the municipality, the developer, and potentially a third-party sponsor. We don't know how often that would happen. So what this section is trying to do is recognize that a lot of what's going to be happening here is through contractual negotiation between the municipality and the developer. But that's kind of frightening, right? Just to say, well, we're going to have this thing go out there and it's going to be subject to contractual negotiation. So Section 1909 is an attempt to provide some safeguards for what basic strictures does the agreement have to meet. It does not exhaustively say what the agreement has to be. It just says you need to have these things. Other things can happen in the agreement, but this is some safeguards provided to that contractual negotiation. So some basic provisions. The housing infrastructure agreement for a housing infrastructure project shall clearly identify the sponsor for the housing infrastructure project, clearly identify the developer and the housing development site. Sub 3 on page 48, this one's quite meaningful. Obligate the tax increments retained, and we'll come to section 1910C, but those retention periods and the percentages, obligate the tax increments retained for not more than the financing and related costs for the housing infrastructure project. What this is saying is you cannot provide your tax increments for anything beyond these pieces. It's only available for financing and related costs. And this is trying to get at bad things happening in the contractual negotiation when people start asking for the tax increment beyond the purposes we typically think of these as available for under TIF more broadly, right? This is saying it's only going to be available for the kinds of things that we talk about. For instance, if the municipality was doing this, this is the way they would do this. They would apply tax increment financing against that debt and related costs. Let's make sure that you can't have funny business in the contract that circumvents that. So that's what sub 3 is trying to get at. Tax increments only available for financing and related costs. Subdivision 4, provide terms and sufficient remedies, or if the municipality so elects, an ordinance to ensure that any housing unit within the housing development be initially offered exclusively as a bona fide domicile. This has gone through a couple of iterations. The concept here is to try to get at primary residences through the housing infrastructure agreement by building in terms to say you have to offer this as a primary residence. This was initially proposed in House Commerce and then was tweaked in House General. A couple things to call out here. This initially referenced exclusively as a primary residence, and it had a durational requirement like what you have for the incentive structure for affordable housing. So it said until the debt is retired, basically, it would have to be offered as a primary residence. This is being slimmed down, as you can see, to be initially offered exclusively as a bona fide domicile. The changes that happened in House General along these lines were some concerns that you couldn't over time actually track this, and they wanted to use this idea of bona fide domicile to say, we don't want people to just construct an agreement on day one, say they're going to use it as their primary residence, and then sell it off to someone, and they've completely gotten around this requirement. But that was the problem they had to solve for at the point that they included the word initially, right? If you use the word initially, the only restriction is to the first offer, right? And so that's why they included this language here. But broadly, the concept here is let's try to have terms in the housing infrastructure agreement that make sure this is offered as a primary residence. And what you have here is initially offered as a bona fide domicile. So this one's definitely being worked through. I'll also be finished with this section pretty quickly. The fifth piece here, kind of generic language to try to get its safeguards, and this could be tightened or made more specific to municipalities. Provide for performance assurances to reasonably secure the obligations of all parties under the housing infrastructure agreement. So just make sure that you build in safeguards that so that people are carrying through on the obligations they have. That could be things like performance bonds, to ensure that folks don't, that if they fail to perform something, they have to pay as a consequence of that. But I would just say broadly, the way to think about these strictures and why you see, for instance, subdivision 4 provide terms and sufficient remedies, they aren't spelling out specific mechanisms by which these things are achieved, right? You might imagine, for instance, that subdivision 4 would be achieved through a covenant built into the contract to say that you can only offer this to folks who are going to occupy this as a domicile, right? This is saying the parties will know best how to navigate these waters, and let's just give the broad constraints here to say, we need to make sure that you're addressing this problem. How are you providing for primary residences? Similarly, on 5, how are you providing for performance assurances? The negotiating parties can take different tacks. That's how they achieve this, but this is just setting up the broad boundaries in which they are meant to achieve particular instances. And then lastly, in subdivision B, a municipality is required to provide notice of the terms of this agreement to the legal voters of the municipality and provide the same information. We'll come to this later, but we're trying to provide at each instance that there are mechanisms for the public to be apprised of what's happening because you won't always have the same mechanism of public vote on bonding available. But there's going to be a number of instances in which there are public hearings or public notice of what's happening under this proposal. That's the full of this section, and I saw several interested, yeah.
Representative Masson?
Yeah, thanks for highlighting the term initially offered. I guess I share the concerns of those who wonder if that's sufficient. I mean, initially offered, probably turn it into an Airbnb or some other kind of thing. So I guess when my thinking that the jury is still out up here whether that's the right term or not, but we can sort it out.
And we're going to try to sort that out later.
We're gonna try to sort everything out later.
Because
Hope everyone is keeping a list. I have a
Yeah.
list of things to sort out. If you have a list, please keep a list of
Yeah, I have a
things to
list.
sort out. Okay.
because I'm wondering if,
Do you have a question for Tom?
yeah.
Right.
Did anyone talk about if it's not continuously used for the domicile?
So this is why House General wanted to move from a primary residence constraint to the domicile. In any instance, they wanted to make sure that it is the place to which folks are returning. It's their permanent home. That is the concept they were trying to get at through domicile. And the concern with primary residence, which was not a defined term, but just a term thrown out there, was that you could think of it as tied to a day restriction within a year, right? And the example they threw out was someone goes away, say they're a member of the military and they're away for years, like would they lose this piece? I'm not sure. I don't know. Like to me, is your permanent home something you've been away from for 4 years? I don't know. Like
You make a definition that's, maybe I shouldn't ask this.
I don't know, a list of things to solve.
you can, if the question is just, is there a way to have a specific technical term that makes clear whether this has a day count or is just the place to which people return? You can create a technical term that says that.
I was gonna ask if there's anything unconstitutional about any of this.
Not that I'm aware of. Let me maybe give the background as to thoughts on these sections. One, you are providing a benefit to, you're conditioning a benefit that folks receive through financing on particular restrictions that they can pursue, right? This isn't mandating some broad swath across Vermont that suddenly everyone has to, right? You're conditioning a benefit on this particular piece. And the way that we're imagining this being accomplished is through things like covenants, so agreements that folks voluntarily undertake, right, to achieve these things. And we have covenants in place for all kinds of things, right, across the state. So that's the best answer I can give that part. But I think the first piece about conditioning a benefit is important.
Thanks, that helped me.
What is the difference between a primary residence and a bona fide domicile?
The discussion we had, and this was truly a rush discussion on Friday as I ran to Senate Education. They felt that primary residence would have this day count requirement and domicile more closely tracked. The definition they really wanted, the words they wanted, basically, we could outright do this, are the place to which you return on a permanent basis, the place that you call home effectively, which you could imagine not having a day count restriction, right? Like they were trying to get at this someone away for multiple years, but has a permanent home. How do you capture that person? And I think when we talk about primary residences, or when we talk in the STR concept, for instance, we talk about like meeting 180-day threshold. Are you there for most of the year? But I agree with the thinking behind the question, which is it's not so apparent that the word change solves that same problem.
I think we're about to get into problem solving. I see it in your face. And so I'm gonna
Yeah,
ask a different, I'm gonna ask a question.
It was great in question format.
Okay, cool. I'm glad we're getting there. John, related costs, which was earlier in this section, is that defined?
Yes.
I can remember definition times. Thank you.
Did either committee discuss deed restrictions that would require the residents to occupy it as a primary residence? And I know in our community in Woodstock, there are deed restrictions through a program called local deeds, and it's in other states. Did you discuss that?
Yes, that did come up. I admittedly don't know, like, I don't have anything to offer on that front, but yes, it came up and that was, as I was describing before, the idea here was just to provide general terms and the parties who are familiar with how negotiating housing development and the sale of these properties would be in a better position to know what the most useful tool is. And there was explicit recognition that there are tools out there for accomplishing this exact purpose that people are currently using in Vermont.
All right, thank you.
You could also just ask outright for those things.
On the municipality providing notice to the terms of the agreement,
Yes.
that doesn't mean vote, right? That just
No,
won't
no.
happen.
Exactly. It's entirely a notice provision. They could propose terms that the town hates, and then the legislative body could say, it's fine, we provided notice, we've satisfied the requirement here. But the thinking behind some of these is there's different kinds of pressure that you can apply to a duty, right? You can require a vote. You can say that there's a restriction that you have to be met. There's another thing here, which is that anytime something has to be made available as a public vote or provide notice it requires a recognition by the legislative body or whoever the party is that this is going out in front of people and they better be aware of what they're including in it. So lighter touch is the way I would describe some of these. Thanks.
No, I'm good.
Okay, onwards. We're at maybe the core section of the bill. So section 1910, this is the actual application. This sets out the hoops that a municipality has to jump through to access tax increment financing. This is VEPC's approval process for the CHIP program. So subsection A, application. A municipality, upon approval of its legislative body, may apply to the Vermont Economic Progress Council to use tax increment financing for a housing infrastructure project. The VEPC may approve only applications that, one, meet the process requirements, either of the project criteria and either of the location criteria. We're going to come to all of these. Basically, you got to meet all the requirements of this section, other than the incentive structure for affordability, which we'll talk about. So VEPC can only approve applications that meet these requirements and are submitted on or before December 31st, 2035. So building in a sunset effectively of the program, there's a final application date, the end of 2035. So I mentioned sets of requirements that have to be met for each of these applications to access tax increment financing. First is the set of process requirements. And I'm on page 49, section C. VEPC shall review a municipality's housing infrastructure project application to determine whether the municipality has created that project, the housing infrastructure project and housing development site pursuant to section 1908. So has it followed the process we just talked about, creating that housing development plan, creating the map, listing with the lister, and having public hearings? Have they executed a housing infrastructure agreement for the housing infrastructure project that adheres to the standards of section 1909? This is the section we just walked through with a developer, and if the municipality is not financing the housing infrastructure project, with a sponsor. So have they created and executed a housing infrastructure agreement that meets the standards of 1909? And this would mean that I take this to be somewhat of a substantive check. Does it adhere to the standards of section 1909? There should be some check against the standards there. And the last process requirement, have they?
Can someone please remember to ask VEPC tomorrow exactly how they would check that adherence? Thank you.
Lastly, have they approved or pledged to use incremental municipal tax revenues for the housing infrastructure project in the proportion provided, which we'll come to later? This aligns with the kind of process requirement we have for TIP districts. I think of this as like a good faith effort request. Are you putting forward as much effort on the municipal tax increment as you are on the education property tax increment? And in any event, it's going to be a higher threshold, as you'll see. So those are your process requirements. Did you create your development site and your housing infrastructure project? Did you execute a housing infrastructure agreement that meets the standards of section 1909? And did you pledge to use your municipal increment as much as the others? Subsection D, your actual project criteria. This is the housing. This is the core of the housing component of the CHIP program. You may recall that when this came across from the House, the extent of the project criterion was, does the development include housing? It had no particular threshold, didn't spell out what housing was. It just said, does it include housing? Theoretically, you could have satisfied that with one unit of housing. This has a more substantive request for what will be required. So VEPC shall review. I should pause and say there's a there are two routes that a project can take. First, you can go under this subsection 1, subdivision 1. You'll recall that I said Betsy's approval is contingent on meeting either of the location criteria. So you can meet either subdivision 1 or you can meet subdivision 2. Subdivision 1, I think of as the standard route, although we will see if this bill passes, if it becomes in effect the standard route. So Betsy would review a housing infrastructure project application to determine whether at least 70% of the gross floor area of the projected housing development is dedicated to housing and the proposed housing development furthers the purposes of section 1907. Excuse me. Okay, I appreciate that. So you have to meet, you can meet this subdivision 1, which is at least 70% of gross floor area. And just to call that out, gross floor area is a broad concept, right? It's all the floor area within a building, basements, attics, elevators, that sort of thing. It's a broad bucket. So it's a particular category. You could think of different criteria here: usable space, occupiable space.
Did you just say it's a flawed?
No. It's a broad. It's a broad. If I did say that, I would have to retract what I
Yeah.
said.
I heard it's flawed. I don't know.
I feel like sometimes maybe I do say things like that, but.
Second.
So subdivision 1, 70% of gross floor area of the projected housing development dedicated to housing. So large amount of floor area dedicated to housing, and Betsy has to review the application to determine that the projected housing development furthers section 1907, which again, that's stimulating the development of primary residences for households of low or moderate income. I called out earlier that this purpose section was being brought in throughout the subchapter in a number of places. That was efforts that both House committees had undertaken. Earlier, you'll recall that the housing development plan required the municipality to make this determination. This now requires Betsy additionally to make the same determination. So that's your first prong for getting through the door. I call it the standard route, but it may not empirically end up being the one under which most go. It's the
Can I just clarify? Sure, okay. So did you, when the legislative body of the municipality has to determine first that it meets the purpose?
Yes.
And then and Betsy basically has to certify, they have to agree that it,
Yes.
is that what you just said?
Exactly. So the application that they're submitting contains the pieces of information in that section 1908, which sets out building out the housing development plan, right? The housing development plan would contain the municipality's determination to that. And then Betsy would receive this packet and would make the same determination. So they could look at what the municipality says about it and can agree or not.
Okay.
So that's your first route in, your first project criterion. If you cannot meet this numerical threshold, which is the easiest way to think about this piece, there is another thing that you can do. So on page 50, subsection 2, and this was new to the House approach, this was added by House Commerce. If Betsy determines that a project application satisfies everything but that first project criterion that we just talked about, if it can't meet the aggregate threshold, but it does meet everything else under this section, meaning it would get through the door, but for this specific requirement, Betsy will request a new board, the Community and Housing Infrastructure Program Board, to determine whether the projected housing development will meaningfully address the purposes in section 1907 and the housing needs of the community. And the board's affirmative determination will satisfy this project criterion. I will just say this sentence has become quite unwieldy as it has moved. But basically what this is saying is there is a separate board, and we'll come to the composition of the board at the very end of this bill. And this board can make a determination that yes, it satisfies the purposes, and we see that it doesn't meet the aggregate threshold check, but we do think that it would meaningfully address the housing needs of the community. You could imagine this being something where, the example I heard thrown out was like if you had a school facility and you were rehabilitating this in some way to become housing. And so you had all this kind of space that would count to your floor area count. And so it would reduce the percentage which is dedicated to housing, like playgrounds and the like, that you wouldn't necessarily have to lose out on that project. And you could have this one-off determination made by the board that they think this meaningfully addresses the housing needs of the community. That's the sole purpose of this board, and we'll come to the section that deals with the board itself. But basically, this is an alternative route. If you can't meet the numerical threshold, this board can maybe offer you a route in the door where they can say, yes, you didn't hit 70%, but we think this meaningfully addresses the housing needs of the community, and their affirmative determination would satisfy the project criteria.
We're gonna ask questions at the end of the section.
We also have subsection E, the location criteria. So BEPC shall review that application to determine whether the housing development site, we're talking about the housing development site, not where the infrastructure occurs, but where the development for housing is going, whether the housing development site is located within one of the following areas. I'm going to skip this proviso and I'm going to come back to this because it will make sense after I go through. So is the housing development site located in one of the following areas? Subdivision 1, an area designated Tier 1A or Tier 1B under Act 250, or an area exempt from the provisions of that chapter, so your interim housing exemptions. Is it in an existing settlement or an area within 1/2 mile of an existing settlement? And I can pull up that section if helpful, so you can see the definition of existing settlement. Or an area located in Tier 2 that has permanent zoning and subdivision bylaws and where the project site would be eligible to become Tier 1 when the improvements are complete. You'll have heard Chair Mahali talk about this particular piece. I think he explained the rationale there. But again, it's 3 different location criteria. You just have to meet one of these. Are you Tier 1A or Tier 1B or interim housing exemption? Are you in an existing settlement or within 1/2 mile? Or are you in this special kind of Tier 2 area? You fit into one of those 3, you meet the location criteria of this section. I do not know Act 250 areas. I do not know when things are coming into effect. I can't, if you want to know more about these pieces, you'll need to talk to Ellen. My understanding is that this is quite a broad swath potentially of the state. And let me scroll up to the proviso now. So this language. BEPC, and I'm not reading I'll come to the highlighted language. BEPC would review the project application to determine whether located within one of those following areas we just talked about, provided that a housing development for which all permits required pursuant to Act 250 have been secured as of the time of application shall be deemed to have satisfied the location criteria of this subsection. The effect of this is to say, if you come in hand, if at the time of your project application for tax increment financing to BEPC under this section, if when you submit this application, you have in hand all the permits that are required for your housing development under Act 250, you don't have to fall into any bucket. You can build anywhere. That's what this proviso does. So I would say that these are quite broad location criteria available under this proposal. But again, you would want to talk to Ellen about what the actual scope of these pieces are. And I know that these designations and maps are currently being. Subsection F, low or moderate affordability criterion. This is your, we were talking earlier about the effect of the affordability covenants in that definition for low or moderate affordable housing. This is where this is being pulled in. Think about this criterion as different from all of the other criteria under this section. When we've talked about the project criteria, when we've talked about the location criteria, when we've talked about the process requirements, those are things that have to be met for any project to get through this program and access tax increment financing. This low or moderate affordability criterion is just about an incentive. It is not about getting your foot through the door. You don't have to meet this to access tax increment financing. This is just to make available an additional increment. And so what this says is BEPC shall review a muni's housing infrastructure project application to determine whether the projected housing development is a low or moderate income housing development, which is that have they provided for 20% of their units being dedicated to low or moderate housing. And we talked about those definitions before. So low would be affordable to someone at 80% of AMI and more than 30% their income, and then no more than 30% of the income at 120% of AMI for a household of moderate income. This is where I was calling out before that if you make available that you can get your foot in the door with a project that achieves moderate affordability, meaning affordable to someone at 120% of AMI, I'm guessing that the track folks are going to use because they have no reason to pursue making it even cheaper, unless it turns out that the financing they can access for an 80% project, perhaps there's affordability pieces that build in that actually lower their financing cost, in which case they could still access this. So I would suggest that if you want to retain if you want to do a concept like this and have it look like this, I might just say, moderate income, and then folks could still pursue affordable housing and satisfy this affordability criteria. So different ways to do it, just calling out that it's somewhat confused as currently structured.
And folks, we're gonna take some testimony on capital stacks to get some perspective.
G, the tax increment financing plan. You'll recall, maybe, because this has been infinite information, that when I talked about the housing development plan that has to be created in section 1908 to create this project, that part of what a municipality has to do, it puts together its housing development plan, and that includes a tax increment financing plan as part of that section. And that is what you're seeing here under subsection G. This aligns with what is done for TIF districts, so I don't have to belabor this, I think. But BEPC does have to approve the financing plan prior to a sponsor's incurrence of debt. So I do want to call that out. It's not only if the municipality is bonding, if any financing is being taken out, BEPC has to approve the tax increment financing plan. So there is a check on the financing for the program, regardless of who is sponsor. And if the municipality is the one bonding, that would be prior to a public vote, meaning that the public would know that BEPC has approved the tax increment financing plan at the point they are voting on any particular bond under this program. The plan would include cost, sources of revenue, estimates of assessed value, portions to be applied to the infrastructure project, resulting increments, amount of bonders indebtedness, other sources of financing and anticipated revenues, and the duration of the financial plan. Again, these are all pulled from TIF districts, so nothing novel here. And that is the full of, and I know there are a number of questions on this quite substantive section, the application section, section 1910.
Yes, Representative Wozniak.
This might be later in the bill. Does what I'll call the CHIP board, in regards to the 70% floor space requirement, does that board have any other responsibility?
Their sole responsibility is to respond to the request of BEPC to route a project through subdivision G2. If BEPC can pretend that they don't exist and do all projects under the 70% increment. And if they see one that they think could get through, but for that 70% requirement, basically, they then reach out to this board. The board makes the determination, does it meaningfully address purposes and housing needs of the community? And that's it. And their determination is final. BEPC doesn't double check that assessment. The board just says, this is what we think about this project. And that's the last piece that is required for that project to get through this section 1910. But just note, it's not as if that determination exhausts the other pieces, right? They still have to meet the process requirements, the location criteria, the like.
So without, and if you would prefer not to answer this and have us ask, Brett Mahaly or Ranning later, what was do you feel comfortable sharing why the committee chose to do that as opposed to just giving BEPC an exception or a waiver power?
Yeah. Oh, okay. Do you have a
I feel
name?
like I could answer this. I think the hope was that it was to find folks with, BEPC does not have expertise in housing, and it was to put together a group of folks who had expertise in housing to determine whether it was housing or just housing.
That's exactly right. When you see the composition of the board, it will speak somewhat to this. At first, I thought you might be asking a broader question, which is why have a sub two available? And the answer to the question that you didn't ask is that when folks wanted to have a numerical threshold, they wanted to provide an out for projects that would be worthwhile that can't. Yeah.
I just further, I guess one thing to add it to my list is whether it's worth it to stand up a whole new board.
Yeah.
To do that.
And something we'll come to as well is that we don't know the scope of projects that will flow through these avenues, right? And so if you have no cap, for instance, TIF districts, there's an aggregate cap on how many can be pursued throughout the state. There is no cap proposed on this program, meaning you could have hundreds of projects out there. If a bunch of these go the subdivision 2 route, BEPC is going to be regularly calling on this board to meet. It doesn't have regular meetings, it just meets upon request. So there's an administrative question as well, like how can they handle the load?
But in addition to just the process requirements and 70%, it's then in the next sentence, then calls or references 1907 as entire chapter. So if the housing does not meet an affordable criteria, as I read that, then it could still be approved as long as that group, that board says, yes, it's a meaningful contribution into the housing market. Do you read it the same?
I do read it the same way. Someone could, BEPC could try to could take a narrow read of this, which is just saying, oh, meaningfully addressed attaches to this section 1907 piece. And the purpose is primary residences for folks of low or moderate income, and it is not meaningfully addressing those if none of the housing is being made available to low or moderate income. But I could see it's not hard for me to imagine a board saying, we think this meaningfully addressed the housing needs of the community and does provide primary residences, and maybe one of these will be made available to someone of moderate, right? You could take a lax approach to this. So I will just say this was one of the Friday last minute additions, adding it before it moved to House General, it just said will meaningfully address the housing needs of the community. They added in the purposes in section 1907. There's a question as to what the effect of pulling that in is. And, you know, I think what they wanted to avoid is folks not meeting, I'm sorry, my trackpad is, not meeting sub 1 and wanting to make sure that the same analysis under B was done, because it's really a safety valve for folks that don't meet the 70%. But you could also say, if the whole point of their determination is to make an independent assessment about meaningfully addressing the housing needs, that's kind of more comprehensive than a codifiable standard.
Yeah.
Like, what is the utility offered by this? Not to say that it's good or bad. I just think it is a question, and I think you're right to identify it. Yeah.
Okay, onwards.
Page 52, I hope this will be a simpler section. 1910A indebtedness. This is largely just drawn from what we do for TIF districts, but with some definitional specific tweaks and some shorter durational patterns. So this is the section that speaks to authorizes the municipality to take out bonding that will be paid for with the tax increment revenues. We do something very similar for TIF districts, but we have a different durational requirement. Just to call out what folks may be asking, doesn't this program contemplate that multiple sponsors can finance a program? Why don't you have language that speaks to a developer or a third-party agency being able to take on the financing for a project? The answer is we don't have to authorize them to do that. They don't need legislative language to do that, whereas a municipality does need a specific authorization to do this. So that's what this section does. It provides the authorization to provide. So Muni approved for tax increment financing. So it has to have gone through the application process. They've received BEPC approval. They've met all the standards we just talked about, may incur against revenues of the housing development site at any time during a period of up to 5 years following the creation of the housing development site. That's your debt incursion period. And it's tied to 5 years following the creation of the housing development site. When I talked earlier about some of the competing effects of when the creation date is set, we talked about how a later creation date, which theoretically could be what occurs when it's BEPC approval that sets creation, might lead to a raised OTV, which you could argue is beneficial to the ed fund. But another effect that it has is your debt incursion clock doesn't start until later in your process, right? So you have 5 years from when BEPC approves tax increment financing. You might think conceptually that those align and there's no issue, but just to call out, that is a meaningful difference as to when your debt incursion clock starts. For TIF districts, your debt incursion clock starts when the Muni approves the housing development site, not when BEPC approves the tax increment financing. And so often what you hear municipalities complain about in this space is they didn't actually get the approval for the financing until a year later, and effectively they have a reduced window resulting from that. The other piece to note here, BEPC may extend the debt incursion period by up to 3 years. This is slightly different than the structure for TIF districts. On the book for TIF districts, you have 5 years. And then if you incur within that first year, those first 5 years, you get an automatic 5-year extension. So you get a 10-year period. You can also ask for a waiver or extension essentially to get a 10-year period. And as you guys have seen, I'm sure, often folks ask for extensions beyond those. And so folks will come and have even lengthier debt incursion windows. This is basically saying maximum of an 8-year window available. If no debt is incurred, the housing development site terminates. This is just saying you no longer have a project or a site if you've decided not to pursue this after your debt incursion window has expired. Pretend that all the stuff you did is gone now. Your housing development site no longer exists. You would have to start the approach over again. Much like what we do for TIF districts. If you haven't received your debt, then you don't have a district.
Do you feel a need towards a break, or do you feel like you're close and we should push through?
Um,
I'm feeling it.
I think this is a question for the committee rather than me. I can go forever, so.
Really?
Policy question?
Policy.
I cannot go for it.
Okay, cool. We have a lot more testimony this afternoon. I think everyone needs to be somewhere at 5, but do folks need to be somewhere, like if we went until 4:30? Is that possible for folks? Okay, great. Okay, we're gonna do that. And we're gonna take a 5-minute break right now.
Perfect.
Taking a 5-minute break. You
Your timing is
helped us do that.
Why, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Happy to facilitate.
Okay. We are still here in Ways and Means and still the 6th. At 3:00.
In my hearing.
No, probably wasn't. John, let's pick this back up again. Thanks.
So John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. I'll be in the Zoom in just a second, I think. I have to get back in the Zoom because it cut me out when I. Thank you.
We still on page 52?
We are indeed. So. Thank you. We were talking about the indebtedness section and we are on page 52. So this is the authorization for municipality to take on debt. We were talking about the potential 8-year period if you'd received an extension from FEPC for your debt incursion. And we were contrasting that against what can be done for TIF districts where you get 5 years plus an automatic 5 if you incur within the first 5, or you can get an extension or a waiver. Section B is just providing for public vote. This is consistent with what we do for TIF districts. So it's saying each instance of borrowing by a municipality to finance or otherwise pay for a housing infrastructure project shall occur only after the legal voters of the muni by a majority vote of all voters present and voting authorize the legislative body to pledge the credit of the muni, borrow, or otherwise secure the debt. So public vote requirement required on each instance of bonding by the municipality, each instance of bonding. And note, because there was a comment made earlier about one line of financing.
Okay.
Note that there was earlier a comment, oh gosh, I lost my highlighter. Made earlier about one line of financing. And theoretically, you could have more lines of financing under this program because you have a debt incursion period. So you could pursue multiple instances of financing, and you might imagine that is likely. I think that developers often space out their financing based on what they're pursuing projects, but would depend on the scope of the project itself. But in any instance, each of those, if pursued with the municipality as sponsor, would require a public vote. Any indebtedness incurred may be retired over any period authorized by the legislative body. So just note that if you tie covenants or restrictions like the primary residence or affordability piece to the life of the financing, that also means that the municipality can determine at least if they're the sponsor in a case, they can determine what the length of that financing is. So they would essentially have a say in what's done. Although I would imagine it's the economic factors that determine the length of the financing and not some strange incentive structure to create a 50-year affordability covenant or something to that effect. Housing development site continues until indebtedness is retired or has that automatic termination if a municipality doesn't receive an extension. And under subsection E, a municipal legislative body shall provide information to the public prior to the public vote. The information would include the amount and types of debt and related costs, including principal, interest, and fees, terms of the debt, the housing infrastructure project to be financed, the housing development projected to occur, and notice to the voters that if the tax increment received from any property tax is insufficient to pay the principal and interest on the debt, the muni shall remain liable for the full payment of the principal and interest for the terms of the indebtedness. This is the same provisions that we use for TIF districts, and what this says is that you're still on the hook, even if your increment isn't providing enough right to cover those costs. The last line here is a technical provision. If interfund loans, meaning they have multiple funds within the municipality, if they're transferring funds within them to finance it, the information must also include documentation of the terms and conditions of the loan. If they're used, so that has to be provided to the public, but if those interfund loans are used, no interest would be charged on transferring among accounts. This is, again, similar to what we do, technical provisions for TIF districts, so nothing novel here. This subsection G has come up a couple of times this session. Another technical provision. So the use of a bond anticipation note shall not be considered a first incurrence of debt. Just because it's come up a couple of times, I want to give some context here. Bond anticipation note is a kind of short-term financing that gets you to the actual debt issue that you're trying to pursue. It's a way of covering you until you can do the fulsome process to roll out that issue. What this line says, you'll recall that you have a debt incursion clause and you're going to have a retention period as well. which is tied to when the first debt is incurred. What this language does is it says that if your first instance of borrowing is a bond anticipation note, that doesn't count. That doesn't count as a first incurrence of debt. So it doesn't start your retention period and it doesn't satisfy the debt incursion clause, that 5 years that you need to meet. This is what's done for TIF districts, so this is not novel, but I've been asked about this a bunch of times. So that's what this is trying to say is technically, we're not going to treat a bond anticipation note as a first incurrence of debt. That's what this language is for. And it affects both your debt incursion period clock and your retention period. That is the full of your indebtedness section. Hopefully, most of that is relatively familiar, although I know the last technical provisions are likely not, even though they're drawn from TIF districts. And I keep rolling if folks are.
Was that the end of the section?
That was the end of that section.
Oh, I had a question that I feel foolish asking, but I'm gonna do it anyway. The mechanics
Yes.
of if the debt is incurred by the developer, how does the money get from the town to the developer?
We will come to some of this later, but basically the simple path is that it's the increment is put into a special account just as it's done for TIF districts. The municipality has control of that increment. And then the municipality will only provide to the sponsor, the developer in this case, your hypothetical, the increments to cover costs of financing. Once that developer has provided a bill or invoice to the municipality, laying out like, hey, we have a payment due. And then once they provided that, the municipality provides the increment just to the extent that it covers the cost of financing. It still maintains the account. And then the developer has to confirm that they've actually applied the payment against them.
I remember reading this now that you said the invoice part. Thank you. Yeah.
So is the developer then one of those lines of financing?
The developer can be. The developer can be the exclusive sponsor for a project and they could pursue 5 different lines of financing if they wanted to. So theoretically, you can, I said 5 arbitrarily, just to be clear, that's not page 54, section 1910B, original taxable value and tax increment. These are the measures that explain how OTV is set. So this should be quite familiar from TIF districts. As of the date the housing development site is created, the lister assessor certifies that OTV and certifies to the legislative body in each year thereafter the amount by which the total valuation of all taxable real property within the housing development site has increased or decreased relative to the OTV. So we talked a little bit about this earlier when we were talking about whether assessments were done on a yearly basis. This just says has to certify each year, and this is the process that's currently done for TIF districts. Under subsection B, annually throughout the life of that site, the lister or assessor shall include not more than the OTV in the assessed valuation upon which the treasurer computes rates, all taxes levied by the muni, and every other taxing district in which that site is situated. But the treasurer shall extend all rates so determined against the entire assessed valuation of real property for the year. This is technical measures to ensure that sufficient funds are raised to cover costs. This is just saying, pretend you don't have access to this increase in property value for that above the OTV when you're determining how much you need to raise, but then actually apply your rates against everything, including that extra value, which is how you end up with an increment, right? You're applying the rate against the full value of the property and you're retaining a specified percentage. But when the municipality is trying to determine how much they need to raise, they need to pretend that they don't have access to that extra funding for purposes of like their budget and what they have to raise for, because they don't. Subsection C, again, all of these provisions are like from TIF districts, so nothing novel here. Annually throughout the life of the housing development site, a municipality shall remit not less than the aggregate education property tax due on the OTV to the ed fund. This is to account for if you have a downward movement in property values in the housing development site. Even if property values go down in that site, the municipality is still on the hook for the full tax due on the original taxable value. This is saying you have to cover taxes on the original taxable value for the life of this project. You're not getting away from that. You may be able to retain this particular percentage, but at the very least, you're going to be providing the full amount of tax on the OTV. And this is what's done for TIF districts. Annually throughout the life of the housing development site, the municipality shall hold apart rather than remit to the taxing districts that proportion of all taxes paid that year on the real property within the housing development site that the excess valuation bears to the total assessed valuation, that is your tax increment, shall only be used for financing and related. It's the concept we've been talking about all along. You have your original taxable value, property values go up. You have this much additional property value available when you apply your tax rates against the full extent of the property value. The taxes against that are your tax increment. That's what's held apart. And those are set into this special account. We're on page 55, subsection E. Not more than the percentages specified and committed for the payment for financing for improvements and related costs shall be segregated by the municipality in a special tax increment financing account and its official books and records until all capital indebtedness incurred for the housing infrastructure project has been fully paid. Final payment shall be reported to the treasurer, who shall thereafter include the entire assessed valuation of that site in the assessed valuations upon which the rates are computed and extended. So this is saying, you know, we have these special provisions that during the project you pretend this doesn't exist for purposes of determining your rate. Now that you've resolved all capital indebtedness, go back to how you were before, include the entire assessed valuation when determining your rates. And thereafter, no taxes from the housing development site shall be deposited in that special tax increment financing account. Lastly, notwithstanding charter provisions, all property taxes assessed shall be within the housing development site shall be subject to the provisions of this section. So they're not to be treated under the other provisions of Title 32, Section 135, your education property tax. Special assessments shall not be considered property taxes for the purposes of this section if the proceeds are used exclusively for operating expenses related to properties within the housing development site and not for improvement. So these are technical provisions to ensure that you don't accidentally pick up measures related to special assessments. And again, this is nothing novel. This is the same way we deal with these problems on the TIF district front. So just maintaining that same structure. That is the full of your OTV tax increment section. We haven't gotten to the actual retention. So just know that the percentages are coming, which is likely what people are more interested in. But those are your mechanical provisions. None of this novel, all drawn from what we do for TIF districts.
Any questions on that? Okay,
Page 56.
seems like all that great TIF testimony last week is really paying. Right?
Yes, it is.
Good.
Nice. 1910C, use of tax increment retention period. Subsection A is something that you don't see for TIF districts, but I think is the premise of TIF districts and just kind of spells out some obvious things that the rest of these programs presuppose. So this is just trying to lay out what are these increments for. Uses of tax increments in municipality may apply tax increments retained pursuant to the subchapter to debt incurred within the period, to related costs, and to the direct cost of a housing infrastructure project. So if they could reduce the cost by just outright providing that increment and reduce their costs of financing, that's an option available to them, direct payment of the cost of a housing infrastructure project. A municipality may provide tax increment to a sponsor only upon, and this is what we were discussing before, receipt of an invoice for payment of financing, and the sponsor shall confirm to the municipality once that increment has been applied to the financing. Any direct payment would be subject to the same public vote provisions as applied to debt. Now for your percentages and your incentive structure related to your affordability construct. Subsection B is your education property tax increment. So subdivision 1 is kind of your default track if you're not pursuing the low or moderate affordability criterion under section 1910. For a housing infrastructure project that does not satisfy that low or moderate affordability criterion, up to 70% of the education property tax increment may be retained for up to 20 years, beginning the first year in which debt is incurred for the housing infrastructure project. Note before that I talked about that bond anticipation note not counting as a first incurrence of debt. That would affect this clock here because it begins the first year in which debt is incurred for the housing infrastructure project. And so if you had a bond anticipation note in year 3, and then you had your actual long-term issuance in year 4, the first year in which debt is incurred would be that year 4 rather than year 3. So subdivision B1 is the route for a project that doesn't meet the affordability criterion. You can retain up to 70% of that education property. We're just talking about education property tax will come to the municipal property tax increment. Subdivision 2 treats if you can meet. So for a housing infrastructure project that satisfies the low or moderate affordability criterion, up to 80% of the education property tax increment may be retained for up to 20 years, same provisions related to when the clock starts. So if you can meet the affordability criterion, that low or moderate affordability criterion, you're eligible to retain an additional 10% of education property tax increment. That is what that construct is included for, to provide an incentive to move folks toward affordability housing, increases the amount of increment that can be made available to cover the cost of financing infrastructure. Technical provision on page 57, subdivision 3, upon incurring the first debt, Muni has to notify tax and BEPC at the beginning of the retention period. It's a standard provision we include just so everyone's on the same page. Subsection C is your separate municipal property tax increment. Not less than 85% of the municipal property tax increment may be retained beginning that first year in which debt is incurred. There is no cap on that because we don't have the same statewide concerns, right, for what happens with the municipal increment. What we're including the protections in BEPC checks on are related to the statewide property tax, not the municipal pieces. You could have an entirely municipal TIF approach that doesn't require state intervention in all of these ways. So the way to think about it just high level is you have your 70 and 85 retention percentages, much like what you have on the book for TIF districts, but you also have available for a project that can meet the lower moderate affordability criterion, an additional 10% available of the education property tax. So it can access 80, not more than 80% of the education property tax and not less than 85% of the municipal property tax increment. Subsection D just aligns the excess tax increments with the provisions that we currently provide for dealing with excess tax increment in a year for TIF districts. What happens to a municipality if it has more in tax increment than it has committed to financing in a particular year? What route does that money take? Does it just go straight up to the ed fund or does it go other places? This works the same way as it does for TIF districts, and it just says of the increments received in any tax year that exceed the amounts committed for the payment of financing and related costs for the housing infrastructure project, equal portions of each increment may be retained to prepay principal and interest on the financing, to place in a special tax increment financing account for future financing payments, or to use for defeasance of the financing. These are basically all measures of preserving that extra increment for future financing costs. So if you might incur prepayment penalties, for instance, you can defease on the books, record that you have the money, but not actually apply the money against that cost, or you can put it in a special account and use for future financing payments. For instance, you might contemplate that you're going to have other future lines of credit or financing that you're undertaking, and so you could retain that extra increment for that purpose. After satisfying those pieces, in subdivision 2 at the bottom of page 57, any remaining portion of the excess education property tax increment shall be distributed to the ed fund, and any remaining portion of the excess municipal increment shall be distributed to the city, town, or village budget in the proportion that it bears to the combined total of the budgets. Same provisions as we use for TIF districts, so just aligning excess mechanics with what we already do. I will note that this next subsection E on page 58, adjustment percentage, this was added in-house commerce. And this is a way, this is a sort of ed fund protectionary measure. We do something like this for TIF districts already. This is a 10-year check-in. So during the 10th year following the creation of a housing development site, the municipality will submit an updated tax increment financing plan to BEPC that would include adjustments and updates of appropriate data. For BEPC to determine, based on the debt actually incurred and the history of increment generated during that first 10 years, whether the percentages approved should be continued or adjusted to a lower percentage to be retained for the remaining duration of retention period and still provide sufficient increment to service the remaining debt. So this is a check-in after 10 years. And if BEPC determines basically that you're getting excess increment in years, you're receiving more than you need in increment to cover your cost of financing, they can downward amend the retention percentage that you receive. So if you were at 70, they can move that downward to 60, say, and basically they would incorporate into their determination what your actual debt incurred and how much increment you're generating to determine do you need that same figure. And that is your retention section 1910C on page 56.
Oh, Representative Feltes first.
The purpose of this whole thing is to promote housing. And so the retention period, so the retention percentage is 70% if it's housing. If you're also low and moderate income, then the retention can be 8%.
Yes.
You're welcome to sit on this side.
But in all cases, the general purpose is for a housing
Yes,
project.
purpose remains the same. Yep.
Okay, all right, gotcha.
Representative Odie.
Thank you. Was there a floor discussed beneath which you couldn't go?
Or-
In reducing the increment that can.
Oh, no, no discussion on that front. And I would just say this is with definitional changes appropriate to this exact same way that this is dealt with for TIP districts. So I don't know if BEPC is built out in rule, but the way that I read this is BEPC is determining, based on that debt incurred and the history of increment generated, whether they should be adjusted to a lower percentage. And they do have a constraint here, which is, I think, speaking to the floor, and still provide sufficient municipal and education increment to service the remaining debt. So effectively, there is a floor, because in any event, they have to specify a percentage that still provides sufficient municipal and education increment to service the remaining debt.
Are you problem solving? or-
No, I'm
Okay.
asking a question. Could a developer or decide to just pay it down to 0 in order, and not take advantage of the increment financing anymore in order to change the project from an affordable one to another?
Interesting. I hadn't thought about this question. I don't know empirically how likely that is to happen if what folks are saying is that these developments aren't currently happening because they don't pencil out. So in this case, but going along with the hypothetical, you're saying a developer could outright pay down the cost of financing. Could they escape then the strictures of this program? And I think the answer would be, if you do have things like the duration of the site terminates upon extinguishment of the debt, right?
Yeah.
So I would have to think more about this, but I do think it just kind of terminates the program as applies to them.
That's what I'm thinking.
I don't know how likely that is to happen because it requires the developer to be in a position to just outright upfront pay a bunch of, right? That developer is likely to just not come to TIP, right? If a developer can just outright pay down, I don't know why they would pursue the program and then just knock themselves out of it, but
So like if there was a windfall, so let's flag that as a thing to dig into, because it's like, thank you for flagging it. Any other? Okay. And I imagine we're going to play with the increment. And that's something that we can do with Pat.
Information reporting. So we are on page 58, section 1910D. This is following a lot of the same approaches we take for TIP districts, but specific here. And I'll have a couple of call outs to things distinctive to housing. So a municipality, and this section includes information reporting that the municipality has to do. It also includes information reporting that BEPC has to do to the legislature based on the collection of data that it received from the municipality. So municipality with an active housing infrastructure project shall develop a system segregated for a housing infrastructure project, identify, collect, and maintain all data and information necessary to fulfill the reporting requirements. So it has a process set up to track information for purposes of this section. Throughout the year, that municipality needs to provide timely notification to tax and BEPC of any housing infrastructure project vote by the municipal legislative body immediately following the debt incurrence or public vote on a form prescribed by the council, including copies of notices, agendas, minutes, vote tally, copy of other information. So it has to, throughout the year, provide that kind of timely update as to what's happening within a given year. Then annually, on or before February 15th, submit on a form prescribed by BEPC an annual report to BEPC and tax, including if they didn't previously submit that timely notice of what's happening in the year, that information, plus any information that's required for annual audit, which we'll come to, and any information that BEPC or tax requires in the form that it provides. So it may require additional information based on its reporting requirements that it has to meet. So that's what the municipality has to do throughout the year, provide timely notice of particular occurrences, and then annually provide on a form prescribed by BEPC some information required for auditing and as prescribed by the council and tax. Then annually on or before April 1, BEPC, rather than the municipality, and the Department of Tax shall submit a report to the Senate Committees on Economic Development, Housing and General Affairs, Animal Finance, and the House Committees on Commerce and Economic Development, on General Housing, and on Ways and Means, on housing infrastructure projects approved pursuant to this chapter, including for each. So this would collate the information they have received and tell you guys the date of approval, the description of the housing infrastructure project, OTV of the housing development site, the scope, value of projected and actual improvements and developments in that site, including the number of housing units created. So that was a specific addition beyond what is included for TIF districts. This is trying to get it, in particular, housing units created. Same for subdivisions 5 and 6. These are new additions that occurred in the house. The expected or actual sale and rental prices of any housing units, the number of housing units known to be occupied on a basis other than as primary residences. I would say that this specific information reporting piece on known to be occupied other than as a primary residence was included before any covenants were included in the housing infrastructure section that were trying to get at offering these as bona fide domiciles. This was meant to be, this information reporting piece, which may still be useful, was initially a light-handed touch to try to apply some pressure to get folks to only offer residences as primary residences by making it clear that if the municipality knew that they were being offered as primary residences, the legislature would have a check-in to see that that is the case. But I would note the mens rea here, the mental state required here. The only information required is if the municipality knows that. It's not an independent requirement that they go out and investigate. But in any event, that was included before there was a piece added to the housing infrastructure agreement to acquire terms for offering as a domicile. Other housing related pieces in the information reporting provisions, the number and types of housing units for which a permit is being pursued under Act 250, and for each applicable housing development, the current stage of the permitting process, projected and actual incremental revenue amounts, standard TIF, allocation of incremental revenue, and projected and actual financing. 8, 9, and 10 are what we do for TIF districts. So nothing novel there. Subsection C is, so we've just talked about what municipality has to do on an annual basis, and we've also talked about what VEPC and tax have to do on an annual basis. Now we're jumping to a final check-in on the a 5-year check-in on the program. So on or before January 15th, 2030, VEPC shall submit a report to committees of jurisdiction that, page 61, describes for each housing development site the change in assessed valuation and municipal grand list across the life of a project. I would just note that you're likely to already have this information from the annual information that you receive. So the more substantive additions to this 5-year check-in are subdivisions 2 and 3. Describe barriers municipalities, developers, and sponsors encounter in using CHIP and provide considerations for updating the CHIP program to address any barriers. So this is saying in 5 years, VEPC, tell us if you discover, and presumably this is going to be an ongoing conversation, even if you didn't have this 5-year requirement, what struggles are communities facing in trying to access the program? How can we address them? And particularly given that some of the genesis for the program is to make this more widely available tax increment financing for smaller communities, you can think of this concern as tied to that. In subsection D, you have a final check-in preceding that application submission deadline. You'll recall that you have that final date, end of 2035 is the final date at which you can apply for tax increment financing under this program. So this is a requirement that at the legislative session that directly precedes that deadline, so in 2035, on or before January 15th, 2035, VEPC should submit a report to the committees of jurisdiction evaluating the success of the program in achieving its purpose, including by identifying the amount and kinds of housing produced and by determining whether housing development pursued through the program meets the criteria of this chapter. And that is your information reporting section, and I promise we are almost there.
Seems no questions. My only question was the difference between the 5-year and the 1 year, but you answered that before I even got to ask it, so thank you.
Yes. Section 1910E is your auditing section. And this is largely pulled from the TIF district section. Annually on or before April 1 until the year following the end of the period for retention of the increment, a municipality with a housing infrastructure project approved under the subchapter shall ensure that there's tax increment financing account is subject to an annual audit prescribed in section 1681 or 1690 and submitted to VEPC. Your section 1681 is a municipal audit, so it might be the municipality conducting this particular audit. And so what you see in this next provision, if an account is subject only to the audit under section 1681, that municipal audit, the council shall ensure a process is in place to subject the account to an independent audit. So in any case, you're going to receive an independent audit. It's not just going to be the municipality checking in on whether it's following its own procedures.
I would love to talk to Betsy and maybe someone else about this tomorrow. It seems like a really important provision, and it also seems like a very complex provision for what might be a very small property. And so I want to understand what that looks like a little better.
And just to build out what some of that audit would be, it includes verification of the OTB and the annual and total municipal and education property tax increments generated, expenditures, and current balance. So is the math adding up, folks actually reporting the OTB? Section 1910F is a guidance section. This includes your rulemaking provisions and some guidance that ACCD can offer. And this aligns, it's a slightly slimmed down version of the process that's taken for, TIP districts. So not as robust, but does provide for some significant input from ACCD and VEPSI to municipalities if they have questions about how this program works. So under sub A, the Secretary of Commerce and Community Development, after a reasonable notice to a municipality and an opportunity for hearing, may issue decisions to munis on questions and inquiries concerning the administration of these housing infrastructure projects, statutes, rules, noncompliance, and any instances of noncompliance identified in audit reports. So they can receive a hearing after a reasonable notice, and the Secretary would issue a decision. VEPSI is to prepare recommendations for the Secretary prior to any decision under that subsection. The Council may prepare those recommendations in consultation with tax, the AG, and the State Treasurer. And in preparing those recommendations, the Council shall provide the municipality with a reasonable opportunity to submit written information. So basically, you can imagine, for instance, if there's an identified issue in an audit, noncompliance, they'll have the opportunity to work with the Council to develop a particular recommendation, which would be submitted to the Secretary of Commerce and Community Development, who would then issue a decision. And under subsection C, the Secretary shall review the recommendations of the Council and issue that final written decision on each matter within 60 days following receipt of the recommendations. There's a time limit. Secretary may permit an appeal be taken by any party to a superior court for determination of questions of law in the same manner as provided for appeals before final judgment. This has not been tweaked in any way. This is what we do for TIF districts. So these are the measures that are currently used for municipalities that are pursuing questions about how statutes and rules are being interpreted or any particular instances of noncompliance. I don't know how folks avail themselves of this, but it is available under TIF districts. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, subsection D is the authorization for rulemaking. So VEPSI may adopt rules that are reasonably necessary to implement this subsection. So broad rulemaking grant to help build out this program.
Questions?
Are you done?
Yes.
Okay, great. Representative.
Quick one. Whenever you say it's same as TIP, I'm writing it same as TIP in the margin, but basically, if it's not the same, can you give us a list of what's same as TIP versus not same as TIP so that
I appreciate, Dear John Gray is staffing H454 in addition to this bill.
just maybe from now on, before you say anything, just say same as TIP.
Yeah, I try to call out.
The end, and then I'm just like, oh, well.
Oh, you want me to say it at the start?
Yeah.
Okay, I can definitely do that. Sorry. I do try to note if something diverges from TIF districts, if we're creating something novel, and if it's house generated or Senate generated.
Just one break.
Now that we've made it through the whole thing, yes.
Well, I've been doing it, but still.
So page 63, this is not TIF districts. This is new. Section 1910G, the Community and Housing Infrastructure Program Board. This is that board that is empowered to make that one determination for the project criteria under subdivision D2 1910 for your VEPSI application for tax increment financing. So who is that board? What do they do? Subsection A, there's created the Community and Housing Infrastructure Program Board. I didn't have a creative name, so that's what it is. To assist VEPSI with evaluating a municipality's housing infrastructure project application pursuant to subsection 1910D. The membership is composed of the State Treasurer, serves as chair, the Executive Director of VHFA. Recall that Chair Kornheiser already talked about some of the expertise offered by this specific board as to why they might be able to make a determination that VEPSI is ill-equipped to make as regards, does it meaningfully serve the housing needs of the community? Think about VHFA's presence on this board. So State Treasurer, the Executive Director of VHFA, the CEO of VEDA, the Vermont Economic Development Authority, the executive director of the Vermont Bond Bank. As you can imagine, they may have a lot to say in the financing that's happening, and the executive director of the Vermont League of Cities and Towns. So membership of 5, chaired by the treasurer, and includes representatives of VHFA and Bond Bank, which are the ones that stand out to me.
Wait, no, we're gonna finish section.
The duties are exactly as we've been discussing upon request, and it's only upon request of BEPC, but BEPC is required to make that request if the application satisfies everything but this one criterion. So upon request of BEPC, the board shall evaluate the housing development plan component of a municipality's housing infrastructure project application to determine whether the proposed housing development will meaningfully serve the housing needs of the community. The board shall respond with its determination not later than 30 days following receipt of the request from BEPC. So it's time limited. And as we talked about before, we don't know what the influx of applications will be under this avenue. The board would have the administrative and technical assistance of the Office of the State Treasurer. The treasurer is chairing the board, so it's housed within that program is the way to think about this. Board meets upon request of BEPC. There's no standing regular meetings, standard per diems, and decisions are not subject to review. So a decision of the board under subsection C is an administrative decision not subject to the contested case hearing requirements of the APA, Administrative Procedure Act, and is not subject to judicial review. These lines, and I said all of this is new, but I will call out where this subsection G is pulled from. Decision not subject to review is not something that I invented. This is the way that this is dealt with for TIF districts, BEPC's application determinations, so that they aren't extensively litigated, right?
Lovely, thank you. Representative Odie?
Yes, thank you. So why didn't you put word designate for the?
The specific request was that this be personal, that it actually be these folks and not someone that they designate. The request was wanting their expertise. And just to call out, the membership was largely drawn from, and I'm going to blank on the name, but there's an existing committee that does something economic development related that has, I want to say all of these members plus maybe 2 more. And this membership was drawn from, didn't want to task that committee, which has a different authorization with handling this as well. So standing up a second board to address just this one function.
So there are 3 committees. The unknown committee, the BEPC board, and this.
What's the unknown committee?
The one that you couldn't think of. Just.
Oh, so that board doesn't have anything to do with this program. It's just that when House Commerce was thinking about what would be an appropriate body, they thought about the board that I can't remember the name of to draw the membership, but it doesn't have anything to say about the program. So you can think of the program as it is a BEPC program, and then for this one specific determination, they reach out to the board. But BEPC owns the program. It's just that the board can make this one determination for a project that basically can't meet that 70% threshold.
Do you happen to know if all of these executive directors consented to this?
The extent of what I recall is that the treasurer and VHFA were in discussions about this, so I don't think this would be novel information to them. I don't know what folks said, but it would not be, I can't speak as well to VITA, the Bond Bank, and the League of Cities and Towns.
Thank you.
Representative, it's like compelling someone to appear. I think it sounds a little unconstitutional to me.
I mean, we make people appear for all kinds of stuff, but I can think more. We- With my immense amount of free time.
In the night.
Any other questions about the bill?
Did you guys want to see the last, there's a contingent effective oddity related.
I love a contingent effective oddity. Yes, please.
So the location criteria, this is section 26 on page 65. There is proposed, and I was not part of this. This was an Ellen addition. I was unavailable in the committee when this happened, but in addition to the location criteria, to build in at the top of page 66, a new bucket 4. So an area located in tier 2, pursuant to Act 250, that is permanent zoning and subdivision bylaws and has been delineated as a transition or infill area on the regional plan future land use map. So this would be another eligible area in which you could build. And again, I would just call out the proviso leading in that has not been stripped. So if you come in hand with all your Act 250 permits, you don't have to fit in any of these buckets. But on January 1, 2028, there would be the addition of this new tier 2 bucket. So new location criteria available in January 1, 2028. And that is the extent of my sections in the bill.
Thank you. Yes.
Okay, and I don't know as though these questions are for John or not, but I've written down a few. I haven't seen anywhere in here, is the developer considered the contracting group that's gonna build the actual housing? That's considered the developer?
Yep, the developer would be the party constructing the housing development and that is required to be a party to this housing infrastructure agreement, which would govern the relationship with the municipality and if there's a third party sponsor then. So it would set out the terms of the financing that's being covered with the tax increment. So for instance, if the developer is the sponsor, it would explain that it would obligate that tax increment to the cost of the financing that the developer has undertaken. It would specify the housing development that the developer is pursuing, and it would provide for those assurances around performance obligations and the like, however they might choose to pursue those. But yes, they would be a party to that.
And I guess following along with that, if that's the case, in the sense of, I didn't see any, it talked about, everything will have to be in hand when they start the project, permits and all that sort of stuff. I guess, a couple of questions I've got is, what if things change throughout the year, whether it's with building codes, energy standards, the company goes out of business, material increases, all those factors that could really affect, like the Burlington High School is $19 million over in just a few years. I mean, I just wonder if there's any contingencies for that.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. And there's two things that I think get to this. One is the assurances around performance obligations is a way to build in for contingencies, right? So you can say, in the event of an act of active, like standard measures that we include for contracts to ensure that if unexpected things, President applying tariffs across everything that raises that sort of stuff, you could build into the contract measures to deal with that. The other piece is rulemaking around, can you amend, for instance, the tax increment financing plan, which is, I think, part of what you're getting at. Do folks need to change what the financing actually is to account for those increased costs? This doesn't speak to that other than to say there's rulemaking available. So you're right to identify that those are potential issues. And I believe, but it would be helpful to talk to Betsy folks about this. I believe that amending the financing plans and the like is something that can be approached through rulemaking, but definitely worth exploring.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? Representative, thank you. So when you say performance obligations, that would be insurance in case of bankruptcy or bonding in case of bankruptcy and all that.
Things along those lines. And I will just say the language is generic. So the thing that comes to mind is like if you wanted to have a performance bond to assure that someone follows through on their obligation.
Yeah.
But just to be clear, the agreement as proposed creates a restriction that you provide for performance assurances to all parties. So the statutory language isn't just protecting the state. It's protecting everyone who's a party to that agreement. You could make it such that it is only drafted in a way to protect the state, and then developers and sponsors would be incentivized to protect their own interests, right, when they go through the contractual negotiation process. I think that sometimes folks get confused about what is built into the statute and what can happen. And it's like,
Well, if you built into the statute to help small towns who might not have experience.
Yes. I just mean to say that you could reserve your protections related to performance assurances just to protecting the municipality. And then it would be up to the developer to negotiate to protect their own interests, which they are going to do. I mean,
I'm sure they know. I just want to protect the small town.
that's exactly what I'm trying to
You're trying to-
suggest. Yeah.
Right. Where's this language from?
This is in the housing infrastructure agreement, and I can give you the specific page. It is on page 48,
Thank you.
and it's subdivision A5. There's line 7. Sorry, it's page 48, line 7. Yep, provide for performance assurances to reasonably secure the obligations of all parties under the housing infrastructure agreement. And I'm just calling out, there's nothing problematic about that language. I'm just calling out that when you draft a statute, You don't have to go out of your way to protect the developer in this instance. But you can.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Sure.
I'll see you soon.
Shortly. Yeah.
Hello. That's a good follow-up question about not needing to protect the developer.
Can you do it later?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So what I'm gonna ask folks to do is anything that you flagged today, bring with you tomorrow. We're hearing from a whole list of witnesses who all have a stake in this. Most of them have a role in this. So be thinking about how you can use those questions with the witnesses tomorrow to get us to the answers we're gonna need and any amendments we're gonna need to make, because we need to be efficient here. Can Pat share his screen, please? Thank you. Floor is yours.
All right, so you're probably not used to seeing me in on this topic, but I am going to do my best TED impression today. What I am going to share with you is posted on the committee page. It's the updated fiscal note for the bill as it has arrived to you. I'm going to try and take maybe a bit of the Cam versus John approach to the different sections. The big picture on most of Cameron's sections is that there's policy language in there. As the bill comes to you, they're basically contingently funded. And just running through the different sections. So section 1, as in the current version of the budget, there is an appropriation there for that. For the manufactured home improvement and repair program, there is currently an appropriation for that. For the sustainability fund, again, there is an appropriation in the current budget for that. This residential universal design study committee, there is an appropriation to account for the per diems that these people are eligible for in the budget. But then when we get to the state housing and residential services planning fund, these people are per diem eligible, and there is not money sort of set aside in the budget for that. So that's a really quick run through Cameron's sections. And so I don't know, you just got a lot of information from John. Do you want me to reiterate some of the program details or just kind of jump to how we're thinking about the cost of this?
Folks have a preference as like a summary refresher, a good way to close out the day, or is it just too much information and our brains are focused? Okay. Summary, please.
So in sections 25 and 26, there is language setting up the CHIP program that would allow municipalities to retain growth in incremental property tax revenues to finance housing development, which is sort of the key part of this. The municipalities can retain up to 100% of that, and then up to 70% of the education tax increment, with the caveat that if they have at least 20% of the units in the project deemed affordable, they can retain up to 80%. And they can incur that increment for 20 years after the first incursion of debt. And just as a quick sort of comparison, under current law, TIF districts can retain 70%. So it's the same for market rate only type projects here, but the difference being if they have that 20% that are affordable, they can sort of go above what's in the existing statute in terms of what you're allowed to retain from the education expense. And then, yeah, and TIF, the municipalities can retain 85 of that municipal property tax increment. So as proposed, and you all have seen, this increment could be used for direct payment of financing incurred to support a housing for a project and related costs, and for any direct costs of housing infrastructure. So sort of everything ties back to housing. use of increment for direct payments would be subject to the same public vote provisions as a municipal debt incursion for the project. And to qualify, there's sort of three sort of broad criteria that need to be met. So the process, the project must show that it has created a project site, executed a housing infrastructure agreement with a developer or sponsor, and pledged incremental tax revenues to the project. Second, that project, BEPC will have to determine whether the project does in fact include housing. And then thirdly, there's some restrictions around what locations these projects can be in. Currently, as would be in effect sort of right away, the tier projects in tier 1A, 1B, or a tier 2 area designated on a state land use or development plans located within a half-mile of an existing settlement area. Those would be eligible. And then there's some other areas which John ran through that could also be included. And those being areas in tier 2, where once the project was completed, would make them therefore eligible for tier 1 status. And then there's the, starting in January 1, those sort of expanded inclusions of tier 2 areas that are transitional or infill designated. And so that's sort of a broad, quick, like overview of some of how this works. And I think this message has been consistent from our office every time this has come up, but we can't provide a fiscal estimate for what the cost of this might be. There's definitely no guarantee, or there's some uncertainty as to how many projects would occur, size of the projects, where they would occur. If they were to occur anyway, would the scope of the project be different? I'm just thinking of a scenario where this is purely hypothetical. With this, a developer might be able to do 50 units. Without it, they would only do 40. So just the size or scope of the project might be different. And that has sort of implications on what the theoretical impact to the education fund would be.
I'm going to speak to this for a second, in hopes that I can sort of frame for the committee the problem that I feel like I'm trying to solve here. So my understanding is that we're seeing right now in Vermont development levels that we haven't seen since the 80s. It's still not enough development. There's still a huge housing shortage. I don't want anyone to ever think I don't think we like desperately need to solve the housing shortage.
Well, you lost 30 pounds.
I don't think.
I'm losing that.
Okay. So we need housing.
Charlie, would you like to stick in? Oh.
I'm sorry, that's very important, Madam Chair.
Okay, and if this program is available everywhere all the time, then I don't see any reason why any new development that's being planned anywhere in the state wouldn't want to take the opportunity to join it. And so that means that any new development anywhere in the state would use the increment for the next 5 to 10 years, which means we wouldn't see any grand list growth for the ed fund anywhere in the state for the next 5 to 10 years. I don't think that will happen on like a one-to-one basis, but like that is the genuine, like real risk that's available with the way the program's structured right now. I don't mean to say it in like a way to scare. It's like, that's where the exact boundaries and limits lie at this. And given where we spent the many months and hours of this session, this is the committee that's job it is to think about the education fund. And even though this might benefit and probably will benefit the education fund in a decade, I don't know if we have a decade to spare around these parts. Doesn't feel like it usually. So I want us to find a way that we can put enough parameters on this that JFO can say, this is the maximum risk that you are taking. Not this is the maximum cost. I don't want to argue that it's the cost. I don't think that's useful. This is the maximum risk that you're taking. And this is sort of how you're managing that risk. And so that's like how I'm thinking about this for the next 2 days. Quick turnaround on that risk. Do you have anything you want to add to, like, did that make sense to you, Pat, in terms of working together on this? Okay.
I mean, there's a couple other points in here that Ted makes, but I think the kind of most important underlying crux is sort of what you're talking about. And it does come back to the discussion about but-for. The but-for can be whether it happens at all, or the scope of the project, or where it occurs. And a lot of that uncertainty sort of ties back to, we just can't tell you or give you a concrete number for this. But yes, happy to work towards, here's a theoretical risk profile for you. I don't know if risk is the right word, but and then just one quick point up also within these sections, and it's a little bit simpler. It has to do with the chip board.
Sure, not risk.
Exposure.
That's lovely. Thank you. Wow, you were
Much
really
more actuarial.
like, whatever was happening. Sorry.
So the chip board, some of those members are eligible for per diem compensation. There is no allocation in the budget as it's currently constructed for this compensation. And another thing I'll note is that typically when you look at a study committee or task force, they're usually prescribed a certain number of meetings per year. So in theory, they could meet 200 times in a year. I'm not saying that's practical or likely, but we have an estimate for per meeting of about 2,400, but depending on how much they're called upon, it could really influence the cost of that.
Wait, who are we giving a per diem to?
People already run.
They're all people who are like paid salaries to do whatever they're doing.
Yeah, if you're on salary, why would you pay?
Okay, cool, thanks. We'll look into that. Thank you.
You could delete that.
Yeah, tiny detail in all the details. Okay. Anything else you want to share with us at this moment, Pat?
I think that's the crux of everything I had to say.
Great. Do you folks have questions for Pat before they have questions for me? Yes, Representative
I
Feltes.
just have one question. The very first sentence here, it says, would allow municipalities to retain growth and incremental property values defined by, would be able to retain 100%. I thought the legislation said 85, because later on it says 85.
It is not less than 85 for the municipal, meaning that the municipal increment could be in excess of 85%.
Oh,
So it
It'd be up to 100.
oh,
Yeah, it's an up to you're setting a cap for the statewide education property tax increment, the most exposure for the education property tax increment. And then for the municipal, you're setting a minimum good faith effort, so at least 85% of the municipal increment that would be dedicated toward this. But you could, as a municipality, dedicate all of your.
okay.
So Representative Higley's hand, but maybe it wasn't. Did you have a
Yeah,
question?
so, Patrick, initially in the fiscal summary section, it talks again about housing developments are affordable. And I know we probably talked about this before, but what is the how do we calculate what's affordable housing? Is there an actual formula that we use to calculate what's considered?
Oh, there is
affordable
some,
housing?
it's a percentage of AMI, I believe it's 30%.
Yeah, we use AMI as defined by HUD.
What's AMI?
Area median income.
Yes.
30%.
Yeah,
It's no more than 30% of a household at a particular percentage of
Right.
area median. So that would be 80 for your low, 80%, and then 120% for your moderate affordability.
There's a chart of that somewhere inside something.
It's described in the language.
Other questions for Pat? For Pat?
Yes.
Cool.
I was wondering if you heard any discussion about once TIF got going in an area that was in one of the 1A, of whether once that building got going, whether there was a need to keep using TIF as it built upon itself. Let's say oh, that went well, let's just do a little bit more. Do you hear any discussion about, well, this is to incentivize the first step and then,
Do you mean in other committees?
yeah.
This is my first committee I've joined on this subject.
Oh, okay.
Ted has been working on this for the whole session and Pat is covering it right now and Ted is not available.
All right. Thank you.
Mhm.
I'll ask Ted.
You're not gonna be able to ask Ted. So
Ask Ted. Okay, so then I'll have to.
maybe John or someone on the
Ask me
committee.
to look into it.
Okay.
Your comment,
Wait, are we done with Pat?
I am.
Okay, anyone else for Pat? Thank you, Pat.
Thank you, Pat.
Okay, Representative Brannigan.
So, about the cost.
Mhm.
If we were to not use the ed fund.
Yeah.
And instead use some kind of an appropriation.
Mhm.
Then we could regulate the costs because it would end when the appropriation is all used up. So we could use, so I had one of the committee members from one of the committees that studied it tell me today that she thought it would be about 6 million a year. But we could say 10 million a year.
Mhm.
And we would know that that would be our cost
Mhm.
every year, as long as we appropriated 10 million.
Mhm.
So I also want to point out that I look back in this handy little folder of paper that Julia gave us not long ago that had all kinds of numbers on it and it went back about 20 years. It's not unusual for us to end up with, this doesn't happen every year, but 25 or 30 million left over to carry over into the next year.
Yes, I don't think that's gonna happen in the next couple of years.
Okay. Okay.
Right,
Well, then that regulation lasts for the first 2 years. Then,
Yes.
then in the future, you know, I'm just saying.
Yeah. No,
You know,
yes.
I acknowledge that this is a great economic development tool, but I'm so opposed to using the ed fund.
Mhm.
We gotta,
And I think we could all, if there isn't money in the general fund for a cap, we could also cap it in the education fund. That's also a possibility.
yes,
Yes.
true.
Okay. Representative Maslin, sorry to keep you waiting there.
That's great about your comment a little while back about what if everybody does this? You know, everybody reminds me in a theory sort of way about our fine, fantastic idea a number of years ago about capping 5% cap. Yeah. Can't remember what we called it, but you know,
Oh, yeah.
it just blossomed, if you to use politely. Everybody said, okay, we'll all do this. No one will have to pay more.
For folks who weren't, Jim's referring to when we put a 5% tax rate cap on the Act 127 tax rate.
Yes.
And every community saw that as just a delightful opportunity to maximize their budget opportunities.
You know, these aren't exactly parallel, but funny things happen here.
Yes. People maximize their opportunities quite rationally at the community level.
So this is eerily prescient, maybe, you know, we have to think about this. So the cap ideas that we've been having just now are right on target, I believe.
Seeing no other hands, I'm gonna appreciate everyone's serious brain use. And see you all tomorrow morning at 9 for a delightful stack of testimony.